They're testing it right now.
Do we need this down at any time? Soon? As soon as...
All right, so
Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, good morning and welcome to Langley Case Day 2015. If everyone could please rise and direct your attention to the front for the Pledge of Allegiance. Please stay standing. Our madrigals will sing our national anthem now.
This isn't mine.
All right, good morning, everyone. A warm welcome to our honored guests and presenters we will be hearing from throughout the day. We hope you're awake. Trey and I are now just running on adrenaline and coffee. Lots of coffee. Also, heads up, he's going to ad-lib, but don't worry, I have speech. You should have in front of you a program that has the background of the case, key vocabulary, staff info, and our very special donors. Without those listed in the program, along with many others, we would not have been able to make today happen. Follow Case Day on Twitter at Langley Case Day, at Case Day Langley, and tweet questions that we may be able to answer throughout the day. We have a couple of Twitter question segments, so feel free to tweet out questions. Students, as we go through the day, take some time and appreciate everything we've done as a class to bring all your efforts together to create this spectacular event. We did it in about a month and a half. We have prepped for oral arguments, contacted countless organizations for information, reached out to our pyramid schools, and brought the Supreme Court of the United States to students as young as 10 years old, and raised enough to continue to do this for next year. We are proud to say that today is the best case day that this school has ever seen, so a round of applause for everyone.
We do have a great store of presentations in for you guys today. Every topic you can pretty much imagine, from science, like a science-heavy chemical addiction standpoint, to philosophies on drugs, to just facts about the Supreme Court justices themselves. So there's something that can pique the interest of pretty much everyone here. There were tons of work that went into putting these presentations together. These students worked very hard on them, did a ton of research. And the presentations came out exceptional, especially looking from where we started at square one.
We hope you find today as worth it as we do. We're sad to be finished, but incredibly excited to see all our hard work, bickering, and countless decisions come to fruition. And now here are your MCs, Weston and Fufi, so we can start the day.
Thank you, Isabel and Trey, and certainly a lot of bickering between that couple.
Indeed. In case anyone doesn't know, my name is Fufi Naji, and over here we have
Weston Simonides.
All right, so let's start off the day, and today we have the History Honor Society with Rumika Imdad and Kitty S. Crizzy, and they will be talking about the history of synthetic drug enforcement.
My name is Rumika. And my name is Kitty, and this is the history of synthetic drug enforcement in the United States. Up until the mid-19th century, all medicinal drugs came from nature. The year 1869 sparked a revolution with the creation of the first synthetic drug, a sedative hypnotic called chloral hydrate. Scientists began to reconfigure age-old drugs with this revolution. For centuries, people had used the white willow bark that produced salicylic acid to relieve fevers and inflammation. To make it more palatable and less irritable, scientists created a synthetic version called acetylsalicylic acid. Better known as aspirin, it became the world's first blockbuster drug.
Pharmaceutical companies created analogs of legal drugs in order to make them more safe and effective. The term designer drugs was originally used for these legal configurations until the early 1980s, when the US government grew concerned over the rise of synthetic heroin. Concern decreased in the mid-1980s due to the rise of crack cocaine, but it soon returned with other synthetic substances such as methamphetamine and ecstasy. Then by the late 1990s, the use of synthetic chemicals like gamma hydroxybutyric increased. These date rape drugs were used to make victims more vulnerable to attack and unconscious.
The Controlled Substances Act of 1970 regulated drugs by classifying them into 5 schedules based on medical use and abuse potential. Drugs in Schedule 1 are completely illegal because they have no accepted medical use and are highly addictive. These drugs include marijuana, LSD, and heroin. Drugs in Schedules 2 through 5 decrease in danger physically and psychologically, and doctors with a government-issued license may prescribe them. Under the Controlled Substances Act of 1970, the United States Drug Enforcement Administration, also known as the DEA, was required to review each drug individually, which entailed a long and costly review process to create a list of illicit substances. People easily took advantage of the act's efficiency by just slightly altering the chemical compositions of banned substances in order to create new chemicals with the same effects. Because the Controlled Substances Act did not account for permutations, these new substances were completely legal, yet just as dangerous.
In 1984, the Comprehensive Crime Control Act was passed in order to amend the Controlled Substances Act. This allowed the U.S. Attorney General to put synthetic substances in Schedule 1 temporarily for public safety. Then, by 1986, it became clear that legislation needed to be more general in order to accommodate the scope of variation. The result was the passage of the Substances Analog Enforcement Act, also known as the Federal Analog Act. This is the act that will be challenged in today's case, McFadden versus United States. It was introduced to the House of Representatives by James C. Wright in September 1986, and it was signed by President Ronald Reagan in the following October. Then in 1988, there was an amendment to this act, which extended it to every federal law. It states that a controlled substance analog shall, to the extent intended for human consumption, be treated for the purposes of any federal law as a controlled substance in Schedule 1.
Bath salts, which are under investigation in the case of McFadden versus the United States, have only transpired in the past decade. They became popular in the United States and Europe, marketed as legal highs, but there has been recent effort by the United States government to crack down on these and other synthetic drugs. In March of 2011, the DEA used their power of emergency scheduling to place 5 synthetic cannabinoids, which mimic marijuana, into Schedule 1 for a year. On October 21st of 2011, the DEA did the same for bath salts. However, this was not enough. On May 26, 2012, in Miami, Florida, a homeless man named Randy Eugene was under the influence of bath salts when he took off his clothes and consumed the face of another man. This horrendous act, among others, led to a push for greater legislation against bath salts and finally brought them into the public concern.
In 2012, Obama signed into law the FDA Safety and Innovation Act, which also included the Synthetic Drug Abuse Prevention Act. This law placed 26 cannabinoids in Schedule 1, and it doubled the time from 18 months to 36 months for the Drug Enforcement Administration could schedule substances in Schedule 1. At least 43 states have taken action against cannabinoids, and 44 states have taken action against cathinoids, the category where bath salts fall. As you can see from the graph, from 2010 to 2011, there was a dramatic increase of incidents regarding bath salts.
And then from 2011 to 2012, the trend decreased, signifying the effectiveness of recent legislation. However, much effort is still required to prevent bath salts from getting into the wrong hands, so we still need to keep up with this legislation. The Federal Analog Act was first examined in court in the case of the United States versus Reichenbach in 1989. Since then, it has faced state and local courts over 17 times because it is vague and requires some knowledge of a substance's illegality. Additionally, the ambiguity of synthetic drug analogs has caused much uncertainty during trials. Despite all these court cases, the Federal Analog Act has never faced the Supreme Court until today in McFadden versus the United States. 2 historic cases involving the Federal Analog Act have been the United States versus Damon S. Forbes and the United States versus Washam. In the 1992 case of the United States versus Damon S. Forbes in the District Court of Colorado, Forbes had been distributing the drug alpha-ethyltryptamine, also known as AET. The court was faced with the decision over whether AET was a controlled substance analog. Allegedly, AET was similar to other hallucinogens, including tryptamine analogs. On the contrary, the court ruled that AET was not substantially similar to the other drugs because it could not be derived from them and its effects were not similar. The action was dismissed and did not move past the District Court of Colorado because the definition of an analogous substance was unconstitutionally vague.
In the 2002 case of U.S. v. Washam, which moved from the District Court of Minnesota to the U.S. Court of Appeals, Thomas William Washam was caught selling 1,4-butanediol, which is similar to the analog GHB. The main issue of the court case was whether 1,4-butanediol was an analog of GHB. Many opinions were presented at the case, such as Dr. Richard Irwin, who stated that 1,4-butanediol is converted by the body to GHB and has resulted in many deaths. On the other hand, Dr. Ippoliti said both of them had different functioning groups, therefore they were not substantially similar. After hearing the testimonies, the jury decided that William Washam was guilty of selling a controlled substance analog. The crusade to regulate synthetic drugs in the U.S. has endured because of the alterable nature and ambiguous legislation. The Federal Analog Act and other recent legislation have helped crack down these fatal substances before today's case. McFadden v. United States has the potential to finally clarify this historically vague law and will set a precedent for future cases concerning synthetic drugs. Thank you.
Wonderful, wonderful job. Thank you. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. And you know, Fufi, I've used bath salts in a bath before, and I gotta say, extremely soothing. I highly recommend it. Not like that homeless guy in Florida, but anyways. So on to our next topic. Up next, we have our first guest speaker, Dr. Ashley Nellis, a senior research analyst who will be discussing the Sentencing Project and drug policy and their effect on juveniles. Dr. Nellis has extensive experience in analyzing criminal justice's policies, as well as analyzing disparities among youth of color in the juvenile justice system. She heads the Sentencing Project's research and legislative activities in juvenile reform, along with working on several youth-serving coalitions. Dr. Nellis works hard to cut down lengthy punishments and end punishment with life without parole. Please give a warm welcome to Dr. Ashley Nellis.
Weston.
Sure, thank you. Good morning, everybody. I hate it when people say this, but do I need this? Yes, okay. It's like they wouldn't have handed it to you if you didn't need it. Thanks for having me here. This is actually not my first time at your case day, although I've never met any of you. I was here in 2009 for the Graham v. Florida case day, and our organization was intimately involved in the Graham case, and it was very exciting. We're not involved in this case. We did not submit an amicus, but we have a lot to say on drug policy, and I have a lot to say on juveniles. So I'll try to weave the two together as much as I can in the brief time that I'm going to be talking with you this morning. I'll tell you a little bit about the Sentencing Project. We have our nonprofit advocacy organization that has been around since 1986, shortly after the Anti-Drug Abuse Act, and in direct response to the act. We came about because of concerns about harsh sentencing for drug offenses and lengthy criminal penalties, including life without parole, for people accused and convicted of nonviolent drug crimes. So our work has centered a lot over the past 30 years now on the disparities between crack cocaine and powder cocaine, which has some parallels to the current issue in that crack and powder are essentially the same components, but the penalties for crack cocaine were extremely disparate in terms of the length compared to powder cocaine when they were enacted. So I'll just tell you a little bit about it. It's a little bit complicated, but essentially when the Drug Abuse Act was passed in the 1980s, it created a mandatory penalty of that established a disparity of 100 to 1 for crack versus powder cocaine offenses. And the way that played out was that it took 5 grams of crack to give somebody a mandatory minimum of 5 years in the federal system, but 500 grams of powder cocaine to give somebody a mandatory minimum of 5 years in prison. Similarly, 10 grams of crack versus 100 grams of powder cocaine. So the issue with that is that African Americans were significantly more likely to be selling but not using crack cocaine in the 1980s. And the reason for that is that it was cheaper, that it became infested in low-income inner city communities where it was a commodity and that where there were not a lot of legitimate employment opportunities. And it became very much embedded within the African American community for a short period of time. There was violence associated with crack cocaine because it was a new drug on the market. Anytime there's a new drug on the market, there's violence to establish turf. And so even people who are who are advocates for equal justice, fair justice, like the Congressional Black Caucus, felt like the infestation of crack into communities was causing harm, and even they supported this sentencing disparity. So as a result, over the following 25 years, our prison population skyrocketed. We now have 2.2 million people in prisons and jails across the country. In the federal system, which is where this issue plays out most, more than half of the people in the federal system are there for a drug offense. And that is a direct result of the so-called drug war that started in the 80s and then was toughened more in the 90s with the crime bill that was passed under President Clinton. So you may have heard, you may not have, that in 2010, legislation was passed that begins to undo some of that. It's called the Fair Sentencing Act. And that removes much of the disparity. It actually drops it from 100 to 1 to 18 to 1. The details of that are not important, but it doesn't make them equal yet, but it makes them much more equal than they were. And so now it takes an a ratio of 18 to 1 between crack cocaine offenses and powder cocaine. And the reason I am stressing all of this is that those two drugs are the same. Crack and powder cocaine are the same, but they certainly cater to different races in our country, and it was very obvious at the start that African Americans were much more likely to be involved in crack cocaine. So like I say, we have not been involved in this particular case, but I do know a little bit about the McFadden case. And I can say that if we were to be involved, I think that we would be very concerned about the ambiguity around the different kinds of these analog drugs and the uncertainty that people have who about whether what they're selling or involved in is in fact illegal. I did a little bit of research. There is not a lot of empirical research on synthetic drugs, the current issue around them, in terms of people's knowledge about it. But one particular study of university students, undergraduate students, who you think probably know a fair amount about drugs and what's available and what's legal and what's not. A study that was done on over 2,000, almost 3,000 undergraduate students found that half of them didn't know what terms like bath salts and very sort of street terms about these drugs, not their chemical components, whether they were legal or not. And in the survey, they were also asked about things that are, more obvious. Marijuana. Did they know that marijuana was legal? Did they know, that other drugs that have been around a lot longer? Says a test of sort of reliability. So the takeaway on that particular study is that even the population segment of the country that is supposed to know a lot about drugs, not that they're all using them, but kids know about drugs, we know that, that has a very foggy understanding about which analog drugs are legal and which are not. So I'll also say that for juveniles, and we define juveniles typically as under the age of 18, their drug use has not changed substantially over the past 20 years. It's about 13% of 8th graders report using drugs in the last year, 30% of 10th graders, and 40% of high school seniors report using some kind of illegal drug in the past year. And that hasn't changed a whole lot. So the other issue that I'd like to mention about this relates to the Sentencing Project's involvement in matters that end up at the Supreme Court. You may be aware of a set of cases now dealing with juveniles who have been put in the adult system and sentenced to adult sentences. The first of which was Roper v. Simmons, and I'll just list these: Roper v. Simmons, Graham v. Florida, JDB v. North Carolina, and most recently Miller v. Alabama. And coming soon, Montgomery v. Louisiana. So this whole set of cases deals with people who have been convicted of crimes, some homicide, some non-homicide, under the age of 18, who are sentenced to adult sentences of either death or life without the possibility of parole. And what the court has said consistently across all of these cases, and is likely to do so in Montgomery, which they'll hear in November, I believe, is that juveniles are different. They have people under the age of 24 actually have not yet fully developed their prefrontal cortex of their brain, which is where executive functioning happens. So this is why, as parents of teens know, kids are much more likely to engage in risky behavior. They're much less likely to understand the consequences of their behavior, and they're much less likely to feel remorseful of their behavior. And that is because their brain is not developed. There's a whole host of other factors that make kids less culpable than adults. I just want to make sure our friend is okay. It's okay. He might be just standing too much, and it's really hot in here. I feel like I'm about to fall over myself. Okay, so in this whole set of cases, basically the court has said time and time again that kids are different, and that juveniles who are convicted of these serious crimes are held to a lower standard. So it's a possibility that cases like this that end up at the Supreme Court, where juveniles are given lengthy sentences, would be given some sort of accommodations for the fact that they're under the age of 18. So I think, I think I just wanted to give you guys just a sense of how many kids are in the system right now before I close, which is that there's about 1 million cases that go to juvenile court every year. And that has fluctuated. It was much higher in the 1990s when there was a crime wave. But for the last several years, it's been around 1 million. Juvenile cases end up in going through court processing every year. Another 5,000 cases end up in the adult system through through judicial waiver. There's been about a 20% drop in the placement of youth in the court system since 2002. Most of the kids who end up in the system are white, although given their presence in the community, there's a high racial disparity. So 77% are white, 20% are African American, and 3% are either American Indian or Asian, and that's for drug offenses. And 13% of the people who get waived to the adult system for when they're juveniles are drug offenders. In closing, I think I'll just say that, I think this is a really interesting case that's being considered, I guess, in the next couple of weeks. It's going to have oral arguments. I don't know, I bet some of you are going to be going. It remains to be seen. I think what a lesson learned that we had from the drug war is that the criminal justice system is probably not the best place to be handling drug addiction. And this issue is sort of the newest iteration of that. We support at the Sentencing Project a more public health approach, and for the reasons that McFadden brings up, is that there's a lot of ambiguity, and at the core, the reason that these transactions are going on is because of addiction. And when we handle that through substance abuse counseling and things like that, we're less likely to have people scouring the internet for illegal drugs. So with that, I think I'll leave you, and thank you for having me.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nellis.
And next up, we have a doozy of a discussion between the Science Honor Society and students from AP Psych. Representing Science Honor Society, we have my friends Noah Flaxman and Andrew McCausland. Representing AP Psych, we have juniors Jonathan Canfield, Brendan Coffey, Shreya Dua, and Sarah Chen.
My name is Noah Flaxman. This is Andrew McCausland, and we'll be presenting on behalf of Science Honor Society on the chemical aspects of the case. So to be considered a controlled substance analog, the substance in question must show substantial similarity in chemical structure to a Schedule 1 or 2 substance, and it must show substantial similarity in effect to a Schedule 1 or 2 substance. The two chemicals primarily at hand in this case are MDPV and methamphetamine, MDPV being a primary component of bath salts. The real issue with this definition of an analog comes when you start to look at what substantially similar actually means. So all the chemicals in this case are considered substituted amphetamines. Now what that means is they're all based around a phenethylamine core with a methyl group attached to the alpha carbon right here. There are over 70 different variations on this basic chemical structure, only 7 of which are actually banned in the United States.
This is the ketone. This is the ketone functional group, and this is something that makes MDPV and other cathinones unique. Essentially, a functional group is a small group of like atoms attached to a molecule that has a potential to affect how it interacts in your body. These are some of the examples of substituted amphetamines. The cathinones are these for here, and these have the ketone functional group. And MDMA and amphetamine are traditional substituted amphetamines. MDMA is also known as ecstasy.
So now we come back to why this term substantial similarity doesn't make sense. Well, it sometimes is used in biological journals. It's not commonly used in a chemical sense for a couple of reasons. It's very ambiguous, it's difficult to quantify in a scientific sense, and it can be used in a number of different ways, meaning that depending on who's using the term, they could use it to discuss bonding, functional groups, overall structure, or simply the molecules involved, which could change the overall result. What this means is that using substantial similarity to determine the structural differences between methamphetamine and MDPV becomes very difficult because there's no real good definition for what it means.
So based on how these two look, would you guys consider these to be substantially similar? Yeah. Nick? Yes. Yeah, the average person looking at these would consider these substantially similar because they're virtually identical. However, these two substances, which are commonly found in your body, actually have very different effects. These are testosterone and estrogen, and as you can see, this little group of CH3 here on testosterone greatly changes the way the molecule acts in your body, despite the fact that they look similar.
While testosterone and estrogen are obviously not analog drugs, They do show how this term substantial similarity becomes an issue, because they do have very, very different effects, which is apparent to all of us. But their structures seem almost identical, at least at first glance. So now, looking at these two structures, what would you guys think? Are they substantially similar? Jenny? Okay, does anyone else have an idea what you think? No? Okay. So this is MDPV, and this is methamphetamine. Obviously, they look somewhat similar. You're looking at some of the same molecules, similar bonding, but one of the key aspects here with MDPV is that you do have this ketone functional group, and that changes the makeup of the chemical in a way that does alter the qualities.
Overall, though, their effects are very similar. Both cause increased levels of dopamine in the brain, which cause the pleasurable feelings, but can also result in some paranoia and hallucinations, such as the man that ate another man's face. They also cause increased heart rate, which can lead to overheating, which is actually very dangerous and can be lethal. AP Psych will talk more about these effects.
So one of the differences, though, when you get to effects between MDPV and methamphetamine is that a lot of these effects can be amplified with MDPV. So the addiction and cravings, when they're testing a lot of these drugs, what they'll use is rats. So they'll have a system set up where a rat is essentially in a cage and it has to tap a lever to get its dose of the drug. Now, when working with methamphetamine, a rat will tap it a number of times and continue to tap it before they actually get their dose. But when given bath salts and they become addicted to bath salts, they were willing to tap this lever 10 times more. So I want to say it was about 6,000 times before they actually got their dosage. The increased level of dopamine in the brain, that can also be amplified with bath salts, in addition to increased heart rate and the increased body temperature. AP Psych will now expand on the addiction aspect of the case.
Thank you, Noah Flaxman, Andrew McCausland from Science Honor Society for presenting for us.
Yeah, wonderful job, wonderful job.
Yeah, testosterone and estrogen, I gotta say, they look a lot alike, but I couldn't think of anything more opposite. Except for maybe fire and ice, Foofy. That might be more opposite.
I think, yeah, a little bit. Just a little bit.
All right, so now we got Brian Riley coming up with some Twitter questions. Brian, how's it looking on the Twitter? We have some questions, but we don't have a speaker to answer them. Okay, so we'll be coming back to Brian later.
All right, we'll come back to you. I guess now we will introduce the political party debate.
Yes, sir. Okay, up next we have the political debate of the century. We'll be having three different students arguing the viewpoints of three different political parties. Debating the question of rehab versus prison for drug sentencing. Ian Beskin representing the Democrats, Stephen Bonacci representing the Republican Party, and Mana Asfari representing the Libertarian Party. Sit back and enjoy the show.
No, I think we're doing the Nels questions now, apparently. Yeah, we are, indeed.
So we are.
Hey,
Brian.
Enjoy.
All right, now for a little Q&A off the Ashley Nellis presentation. These were real questions tweeted in by people in the crowd. All right, we had a question from Delaney Burkhart that said, what is the rate of recidivism for juvenile offenders in adult prisons?
So that's not a very easy question to answer just with a number, but I can tell you that in the juvenile system, kids are likely to recidivate maybe half of the time. A lot of times their offense is less serious than the first one. In the adult system, kids are much more inclined to recidivate. And there's some reasons for that. And they're unrelated to the crime, the original crime. They seem to be related to the fact that they've been exposed to adult offenders, that they've been excluded from age-appropriate services in the juvenile system. So in the adult system, they don't necessarily have a right to continue their education or to participate in rehabilitation programming if it's not for that age group. They may or may not be held separately from adult offenders. They're 34 times more likely to commit suicide. They're about 10 times more likely to be sexually or physically assaulted. And they're usually in an environment where the correctional officers have no experience with working with children. And so there is no age-appropriate response to misbehavior. So for all of those reasons, juveniles who are placed in the adult system are much more likely to recidivate, controlling for the original offense that they committed. And not only are they more likely to recidivate, their offense is much more likely to be a violent offense.
All right, next question we have Brittany Trumbull asks, is the difference in penalties between crack cocaine and cocaine powder fundamentally racist?
It's not fundamentally racist, but it's had a racially disparate impact on the on the way that it's played out. Like I said, even members of the Congressional Black Caucus, which is, as the name implies, the group of legislators in the U.S. Congress who are specifically concerned about African American communities, fully endorsed the bills in 1984 and in 1986 and 1994. And this was because they saw a lot of violence in their communities, in the African American communities. And they, one particular member of Congress said powder cocaine ruins a family, but crack cocaine ruins a neighborhood. And so even African American legislators supported the act. So it wasn't endorsed, to have that impact, but it did have a disparate impact.
All right, Christian Gabler, which is the Twitter handle @ChinLeahy, is asking, should children be allowed to be tried as adults at all?
In my personal view, no, that they do not fare well in the adult system, and it has negative effects on public safety.
Casey Britt asks, what's the Sentencing Project's stance on the role of private prisons in the incarceration process?
It's funny that you asked that. We get asked that a lot. We and others. And that is, I don't know why that is, because there are so many problems with the criminal justice system, but it has almost always been the case that only about 8% of correctional facilities are privatized. It's really, in the realm of things, it's not that big of a problem. But it gets a lot of media attention that it's privatization that's the problem. Running a prison is not that profitable. You could do a lot more things to make money than run a prison. And so we don't see it as a really huge deal. But more importantly, we focus on issues related to sentencing than we do on issues related to corrections.
All right, one of our next questions is, the number of women in prison is increasing at double the rate of men. What does the Sentencing Project suggest for this slowing this increase? Asked by Caroline Wilson.
So yeah, that's a very nuanced view of it. There is a rise in women in prison that's a little bit different from the rest of the groups of prison population, so African Americans, whites, young people, men. A lot of those are going down. For women, we think that might be partly due to what's called the girlfriend problem. So women who are taking the blame for offenses that their partners are committing and then getting sentenced for it. There's also some indication that methamphetamine is part of the rise. There's a lot of theories about why women are more inclined to be, more likely to be in the prison populations these days. We don't focus a whole lot on women, But like anything, we think that prison should be the very last response instead of the very first response to crime.
Alrighty, our next question, asked by Eric Owens, is how would you prevent recidivism if there is less of a negative incentive to avoid these drugs? Great question, Eric.
I don't think I understand the question.
All right.
It might be great.
We'll move on to the next question then. This one was asked by Carly Herbert. She asked, what is the best way to reframe our responses to juvenile delinquency?
Well, in the last maybe 10 years or so, there has been a significant reframing of the issues around juvenile justice, and those have mostly been successful because we've returned to the original philosophy that created the juvenile justice system, which is that kids are, number one, different, and two, that kids are uniquely capable of reform because of their young age, because they are responsive to rehabilitation, and that systems that are designed for adults are especially damaging both to kids and to public safety. So the age-appropriate services, kids, giving them the minimum sanctions that are possible, that was one of the guiding principles of the juvenile justice system. Things like closing their arrest records, not having those accessible by colleges and employers are extremely, we support those wholeheartedly. We don't think it's necessary to punish kids for the rest of their lives for mistakes they made in their youth.
All right, unfortunately, our audience has asked us all the questions there is, but we'd like to give you a very special thanks for coming out here to Langley Case Day.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nellis and Brian.
Now, after the mix-up we had before, AP Psych students are now here. Please welcome, I believe, no, do not welcome yet.
No, so we're
They are
gonna
still not
wait.
ready. Juniors are very busy indeed with SATs and colleges and whatnot. We don't have to fear anymore.
You know, Fufi, I was a junior last year, and
So was I believe. I was a
yeah,
junior.
and I gotta say, it was a tough year.
It
Man.
was actually very difficult relative to the other years.
Can't say I was ever late to Case Day though.
No,
I wasn't at Case Day, but
neither was I.
we are now. We are now.
We are now indeed at Case Day Weston. I believe that is a true fact,
All right.
in my medical opinion. We still have only one junior, and there
Okay.
should be 4. So,
Three more to go.
so Weston, how are you today?
I'm good, Fufi. Fufi, would you like I'll do some stand-up comedy if you want.
Actually, yeah, tell a joke.
Okay. Fufi,
Yes, sir.
how did the man catch up on sleep?
I have no clue.
He ran around his bed, Fufi. He ran around his bed.
Oh, okay, I got it. It's been a long day. Here, I have a joke. What do you call Batman when he skips church?
It's a good question, Fufi.
Christian Bale. Still juniors? Juniors? Okay, one junior still. Wonderful. Could you text your junior friends? Okay, cool. Got any more jokes, Weston? I had one.
Fufi,
friend.
I could go all day. I could honestly go all day.
Frankly, I think we might because there's. Okay, now we got 2. We got 2 juniors. Multiply that by 2 and we have 4. So that's how much we need.
Do you guys want to come up and start?
Do you guys want to do some stand-up?
Do you want to start your presentation? No, they don't. Okay.
It is actually a very difficult year, junior year, especially with Case Day, SATs and whatnot, GPA, college stuff. Yeah. Indeed.
Fufi, I got another one for you, man.
Oh, wonderful. Let's hear it.
Why does a banana have so many friends?
Anyone know? I don't know.
Because it has appealing. It has appeal.
Yeah. Jokes. 2? Still at 2. Wonderful. So, how is everyone today? Good. A lot of enthusiasm. So,
Stephen Bonacci looks good today.
Stephen, are you ready for your debate?
Steven says he does not know. He guesses so.
Mr. Herzig is right behind you. So, what? Okay. I'll do that in a bit. We also got Mana Afsari representing the Libertarians for the upcoming debate. Are you feeling prepared? Yeah. That's wonderful.
She says yes.
She doesn't.
She's feeling prepared. Sounds more prepared than Steven over here.
Yeah. And also we have Ian Beskin. I'm looking in the crowd. I do not see him. I hope he's not skipping as well. Oh, hey. Are you prepared? Wonderful. At least you're here. Juniors? Still 2. So, you guys are ready? All right, wonderful. So please.
We're gonna do it.
Have fun.
Hello, we are from AP Psych, and today it is just Brendan Coffey and Shrey Dua here to discuss addiction. Oh, okay, and Jonathan Canfield now, so. All right, before we discuss addiction, it's important to understand how drugs affect the neurons. All right, neurons are responsible for creating the nervous system, and the nervous system transmits information and signals across the body. In the case of cocaine, the drug causes high levels of dopamine in the neurons. In a normal neuron, you have the dopamine neurotransmitters exiting the neuron and traveling to the next neuron to bind in receptor sites. It then causes the signal to continue transmitting through the body. It then travels back to the neuron through reuptake. However, when cocaine enters the system, it blocks the reentrance into the cell, now leaving the dopamine neurotransmitters stuck in the synapse, the gap between the 2 neurons, continuously binding with the receptor sites, resulting in that euphoria or high that is pleasurable.
Addiction, also known as physical dependence, is defined as the psychological state in which continued drug use is necessary to prevent unwanted side effects known as withdrawal syndrome. With continued use of a drug through addiction, tolerance develops. Tolerance causes increasing quantities of a drug to have the same effect as smaller doses of these drugs. The positive qualities that the brain associates with a drug, such as increased levels of dopamine in the system, leads to the cravings that addicts experience. Addicts return to these drugs again and again to experience these positive feelings associated with the drugs and prevent the negative feelings associated with the withdrawal syndrome.
There are 2 main factors that determine whether or not someone will be affected by drug addiction: genetic traits and social environment. Genetically, if someone is affected by drug addiction, they have a greater probability of coming back to the drug once they begin the drug. Environmentally, once someone has began the drug, if just by getting attention for using the drug, they have a greater probability of continuing usage of that drug.
There are various short-term and long-term effects of drug addiction. Short-term effects include decrease in synaptic activity. Normally, neurons fire in response to natural stimulation, releasing neurotransmitters such as dopamine, which creates a feeling of well-being. However, as tolerance develops due to repeated drug exposure, the brain becomes increasingly susceptible, leading to dependence. Long-term substance abuse can actually lead to physical changes in regions of the brain. Over time, as the brain continues to adapt to the presence of the drug, brain regions responsible for judgment, decision-making, and memory become physically altered, making certain behaviors hardwired. Unlike cells in most other parts of the body, neurons cannot regenerate. This means that nerve cell death caused by toxins in many drugs and reductions in neural activities is often irreplaceable. This contributes to the difficulty for many addicts to stay drug-free, as intense cravings often lead to relapse.
That concludes our presentation. Thank you. So sorry for the mix-up. Hope you all have a wonderful day, and thank you for those great jokes.
Thank you, AP Psych.
All right, and now, after that long wait, we will have our debate with Stephen Bonacci, Mana Afsari, and Ian Beskin.
Excited for this one. Excited for this one.
I heard this is going to be a really great one. Beskin, I'm sure you'll do well. I'm sure everyone will do well. Stephen, I'm proud of you.
Pulling for you, Steve.
Hi, Harris. Are you the moderator? Greetings. Wonderful.
Hello, everybody. My name is Harris Satif. You may know me. I'll be moderating today's debate between the young Republicans, the young Democrats, and the young Libertarians. Our format has changed just a bit. Each representative will have a 4-minute opening statement. They'll have 90 seconds to respond to any questions and 1 minute for any rebuttals. And first, since his PowerPoint is already on the screen, we're going to go with Mr. Stephen Bonacci.
All right, how are you guys? I'm Stephen Bonacci, and I'll be representing the young Republicans in this debate. So before we begin, it's important to understand that both the Democratic National Committee and the Republican National Committee agree that prison reform is both necessary and has to be done soon. They agree that the goals should include keeping young people out of prison, reducing repeat offenders, and keeping our community safe. It's a bipartisan agreement that is set on both major platforms. Now, the facts, this is taken from the Bureau of Justice Statistics in the 2012 report, taken out of the 75 largest counties in the nation. The important thing to note here is the largest percent, which was 37%, were drug offenders, which accounts for about 58,000 arrests in 75 large counties. This does not necessarily account for crime-ridden areas. Now, prior convictions of the drug offenders included 81% with at least one prior arrest, 19% it was their first arrest. Out of the 81% with prior arrests, 74% had multiple arrests, which was nearly 3/4 of multiple arrests. On the next slide, you have about 2/3 had prior convictions. And out of that, about half of them had multiple convictions. On the next slide, you can see that nearly half had prior felonies, which is a staggering rate among drug offenders. And on the next slide, we have about a 2/3 incarceration rate. Now, in the non-incarceration section, that included parole, and the option for other, which is best accounted for accountability courts. Now, on the next slide, there's a couple. There's nearly 1 out of 3 drug offenses occur on the U.S.-Mexico border. And the DEA documents that 60% of those arrested were not U.S. citizens, 53% of which were Hispanic or Latino origin. And I would not present these facts if it were not for the staggering rate of immigration offenses and citizens to non-citizens arrests under drug arrest. The U.S. currently spends about $18.6 million a day to keep undocumented people in our prison system, which converts to about $7 billion a year. Lastly, I want to present you with the facts. This is from the Denver Post. Researched 33 felons linked with 38 murders in the Denver area. According to the report, 29 of the parolees committed violations, ranging from using cocaine and moving without permission before they were arrested for murder. One of which is the man listed here, Ishmael Shelton, who was on parole before he told his PO officer he was on cocaine shortly after stabbing his girlfriend to death. Point I'm showing you here is, do you really want these people wandering your streets, being around your kids, or in our society? So what we propose, based on the facts, is harsh but fair sentences for drug offenders. It has a greater success in rehabilitation, it's less money in the long run, and it keeps bad people off the streets for long periods of time. Directly from the RNC, they say, quote, "We support mandatory prison sentencing for repeat drug dealers, rape, robbery, and murder. We oppose parole for dangerous or repeat felons." And then we also want to free up the near $7 billion that we spend on undocumented people in our prison system to use for block grants and longer incarceration rates for repeat drug offenders. And we would like to leave the option for rehabilitation for those under the age of 30, as that only accounts for about 12% of the prison population. And we would rather see that it is used on a local municipality basis opposed to a federally mandated structure. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Next, representing the Young Democrats, Mr. Ian Beskin. You have 4 minutes.
Hello, I'm Ian Beskin, and today I'll be representing the Young Democrats. The Democratic stance on prison reform is similar to the Republicans in that we recognize the benefits of stricter punishments in certain cases and encourage them as a means of reducing recidivism, with the condition that mandatory minimums are not used. Mandatory minimums are minimum sentences for certain crimes. They take away the flexibility of the judge and jury from providing a more appropriate sentence, often resulting in punishments excessive for the crime committed. Additionally, they're ineffective because mandatory minimums by nature result in low-level drug dealers receiving huge penalties, while the upper echelons of drug lords often get lower sentences as a result of better attorneys and more money. As a result, we end up punishing the wrong people. Furthermore, the Democratic Party is fully in favor of rehabilitation for drug abusers, providing not only medical care, but re-entry programs. While many rehabilitated inmates return to prison for abuse, a combination of stricter punishments and when appropriate and rehabilitation is the most effective way of ensuring that people do not return to prison, saving tax dollars. The average cost of rehab ranges from $12,000 to $25,000 per month, and the average time of rehab is 28 to 45 days, so give or take a month. Comparably, it costs $31,286 per year on each inmate. So simply offering stricter punishments is not a cost-efficient way of reducing recidivism. Additionally, it is not the correct moral stance to simply put larger punishments on people when we can instead trying to be helping them and improving our society. Additionally, rehab has been proven to be effective. In San Francisco, participation in a re-education program for as little as 4 months reduced the frequency of violent reoffending after leaving jail by 83%, compared with a matched control group in a conventional jail. Coupling drug treatment with education and more appropriate sentencing would reduce recidivism and not only save money in the long run, it is the correct moral decision to help these people who need the help and to provide them a second chance with education and the ability to reestablish their lives. Having said all of that, the Democratic Party fully believes that the most efficient solution is not in fact rehab, but rather an attack on the supply and demand of drugs in the first place, thus lowering incarceration rates. The United States is one of the largest importers of drugs in the world, and most of the drugs that we receive, or most of the drugs in the country, are imported rather than made here. As a result, we believe that it's more efficient to try and combat the drugs and reduce the rate that it's being imported by providing more funding to the Coast Guard so that they can continue their drug searches, and to provide better community support. Have the community deal with problems initially and just resolve it there before they end up in prison. At the same time, we want to continue to implement the educational institution that we have now and keep educating people about the results and effects of drugs to discourage young people from ever using them in the first place. Ultimately, the Democratic Party wishes to attack the greater issue. The party hopes to reduce incarceration rates, make the country safer, and do it in a way that is cost-efficient and effective and meaningful for the people that we are trying to impact. We want more than to just punish the crime. We want to solve the problem. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ian. And now we have Mana representing the Young Libertarians.
Now, I don't have a fancy PowerPoint, but I do have something called common sense and regard for life, liberty, and property. So I'd like to open by calling to attention one of the greatest hypocrisies of our government's war on drugs. Our last 3 presidents, Obama, Bush, Clinton, all have admitted to using illegal drugs in their lifetimes. Would anyone here, or they, also posit that our nation would be better off had they been arrested and incarcerated? With the assumption that your answer is no, regardless of your opinion of their administration, I'd like to ask how then you would justify punishing others for the exact same crime. These presidents were merely exercising their free will, no? Their liberty, an inalienable right? And here they are today, unwittingly perpetuating hypocrisy on a massive scale. It is this hypocrisy that ruins the lives of men and women who simply wish to exercise their second inalienable right. So once imprisoned, the average drug user has already lost his liberty, sure, but then loses his property, the exercise of his property, by being imprisoned. And in some cases, such as the case of the 3 strikes law, often used in California, he loses his life as well. So that's all 3 inalienable rights. The Constitution completely overlooked, completely undermined. Now, if you don't care for the Constitution, and if you don't think there's a reason that our country is founded on it, sure, okay, I'm gonna let you have your freedom of speech. But I want to appeal to the fiscal conservative in you. We spend $19 billion a year on drug enforcement alone. I'm going to use a strategy that Dwight D. Eisenhower once used to just display the scale of this money. Drug enforcement costs $19 billion a year. $19 billion a year can purchase 1,881 modern brick schools, much nicer than the one we're currently standing in. 38 electric power plants that could easily solve our renewable energy issue. And 38 fully equipped hospitals and 950 miles of concrete highway. We pay for drug enforcement with 9.5 million bushels of wheat. We pay for drug enforcement with thousands and thousands of homes that could be better put to use, housing the homeless, who constitute a much larger issue. No, though we libertarians don't believe in spending money on persecuting victimless crimes, we do believe in putting the taxpayer's dollar to better use. We are so far gone from our heritage of American liberty and life and property that we hardly know how to begin the end of our war on drugs. Here are a few suggestions from the Cato Institute to get us started. We believe that we should repeal the Controlled Substances Act of 1970, the same act that these 3 presidents who had used drugs in their lifetime were elected after, following this act. So clearly it doesn't even have an effect on those who execute it. We repeal the federal mandatory minimum sentences and the federal sentencing guidelines, and we direct the administration not to interfere with the implementation of state initiatives that allow for the medical use of marijuana. And lastly, bear with me, we shut down the Drug Enforcement Administration. I believe this is more than enough to begin our debate today and to begin the end of the war on drugs and the war on our liberty. Thank you.
Thank you. After reviewing these presentations, I have come up with some questions that were arranged beforehand. The the representatives have not seen these before. I ask them right now. To Mr. Bonacci, first of the Young Republicans, you state that there is quote unquote bipartisan agreement that prison reform should be a priority for our government. If such bipartisan agreement exists, why haven't common sense prison reforms been implemented yet? You have 90 seconds.
I think most of that has to do with the fact that prison reform also involves rehabilitation now, as that has become a popular policy. It's been accepted by the public. I think that, obviously we have different stances on where the taxpayer money should be implemented and whether that should go into rehabilitation centers or whether that should go into infrastructure, other areas where we could better use it. So I think that answers the question.
Thank you. Mr. Beskin, the United States is still recovering from one of the largest economic downturns since the Great Depression. You state that the average cost of rehab ranges from $12,000 to $25,000 per month per inmate, versus the average cost of housing a prison inmate, which you say is $31,286 per year. Why should the American taxpayer pay for a month of rehab, which can run for $25,000, versus an entire year of incarceration, which would just cost $6,000 more?
That's a very good question, thank you. And essentially, it would be an upfront cost, but it would have returns over a long period of time. Rehabilitation, such as the one in San Francisco jails, saved taxpayers $4 for every $1 spent. So then the average person saved roughly $30,000 a year per person as a result. So it's clear that over a long period of time, it will be beneficial to reduce the recidivism rates and actually reduce the cost to taxpayers.
May I remind our debaters that if you would like a 1-minute chance to respond, simply indicate that. Mana, would you like to respond?
Yes, before
Absolutely.
I answer my question or even receive it, I'd like to respond to both my counterparts. So regarding the bipartisan question that was addressed to Mr. Bonacci, bipartisan, I believe there are three parties right here today presenting their cases. Forget partisans, focus on a nonpartisan, omnipartisan approach. Republican red tape and democratic despotism is not going to solve the war on drugs. We need all sides of the issue to speak, and we need all sides of the issue to agree, or at least voice their opinion until we come to resolution. So I'd like to say that, first of all. Secondly, regarding the economic downturn question addressed to Mr. Beskin, why should Americans have to pay it all for the war on drugs? Let alone just the inherent nature, the inherent arbitrary nature of taxation. The last thing we should be taxed on is, I guess, prosecuting people for exercising what they want to do with their bodies and their liberty. It's totalitarian. It does not make any sense whatsoever. It undermines our Constitution, and it is the reason that we have all these people in prisons. It is the reason that people's lives are being destroyed, and simply I am against it.
Thank you.
I get 1 second to respond to that.
1 minute, yes.
All right. To answer Mana's response, quite frankly, I think absolutely legalizing everything actually creates a system where you're not advocating for a libertarian approach. You're advocating for something that the far left, maybe even a socialist would approve of. And that you are creating a system that then people become dependent on federal funding for rehabilitation. They become dependent on other systems to care for their addiction. And the classic example here is in a place like Amsterdam, where they now spend millions upon millions of dollars a year to rehabilitate individuals that have drug addiction issues that they legalized, years ago, which they are now repealing. So I don't really see your stance as a libertarian. I see it more as a socialist. So.
Thank you. Mana, your first question for the young libertarians. Oh, yes. Well, that was actually a question directed to you, so you can't rebut yourself. Well, okay, sorry. You call for the full legalization of all currently federally illegal drugs. How can you justify this belief to the average American who would most likely consider this view rather extreme? How can you prove to them that a large-scale legalization of all drugs would do more good than harm?
I don't have a lot of time, but let me begin by pointing out just the sheer, I guess, misunderstanding that Mr. Bernacci and I have about what a libertarian is. A libertarian is almost the polar opposite of a socialist, and honestly, any basic knowledge of government, which I assume whoever is taking AP government or any government class at Langley would have. Anyway, so I challenge the conservatism that is against legalization by quoting Thomas Paine, clearly an American icon for the virtues of American society. Thomas Paine once said, "Those who expect to reap the benefits of liberty must undergo the fatigue of supporting it." Now, that does not mean that we should tax people. That's not the fatigue I'm discussing. It's the fact that if you want to have the liberty to do with your body as you wish, which I'm sure everyone here would agree with, unless you enjoy not having that liberty, then you should support everybody's right to do the exact same. It's simply, on just such a simple basis, not supporting hypocrisy. I understand that legalization of all drugs is crazy. Since we were in elementary school, we've been told that drugs are bad and whatever, but the fact is that's a medical concern. It is from a medical standpoint. There is no government on this earth that should be allowed to tell us what to do medically. They're simply not authorized. And who is the government to legislate ethics? There is no way to legislate ethics, as there is no way to legislate racism. Society makes laws. Laws do not make society. That's it.
Anyone care to rebut?
Yeah, I'll rebut. All right, so we have time. Apparently we got a clock to burn. So I hope you all don't mind. Either way, though, aren't you fundamentally preying on the weak who have an addiction? Then I mean, let's face it, they're not able to pay for their addiction in the first place, and not to mention, you mentioned what to do with our body, and the government shouldn't intervene in that. If you look at a state like Colorado, they've legalized marijuana. Crime rates have dropped, but petty crime rates have increased, and that's been rancid across the board. You have neighborhoods that were perfectly fine, safe neighborhoods initially 3-4 years ago that are now rancid with burglary, their muggings, there are all sorts of stuff going on. It's increased by, I think the last statistic I saw was 50%. So how do you justify that as a way to actually better our system? I mean, it doesn't make sense. You're making people not only dependent, but then you're gonna have to throw more money at the problem. A true libertarian approach would have been just complete hands off, and if you have an addiction, you would deal with it yourself.
Mr. Beskin?
I agree that people should have the right to their body, but at the same time, you wouldn't give a baby a toy in which he could choke himself with. 46,471 drug-induced deaths in the year of 2013, many of whom were juveniles, people who are unaware of the extent of the effects of their drugs. So to say that we all have the right to their body is fine, but then to go ahead and say that we should legalize all drugs so that more kids can use them and end up killing themselves by accident with this is completely unacceptable. And to address a point that you made earlier about having a nonpartisan agreement, nonpartisan agreement at this point is very idealistic, and we would love to make it happen, but at this point it's unrealistic. And at the same time, when we actually have a significant number of libertarian candidates elected in Congress, that'll be more significant. But as of right now, there are no libertarian candidates in Congress.
Thank you. Next question goes to Mr. Bonacci. One of your proposals calls for quote unquote harsh but fair sentences for drug offenders. You previously mentioned that 37% of felony defendants are facing some version of a drug offense charge. Would these harsh but fair sentences not just increase the amount of inmates already in an overburdened American prison system?
Well, to answer that question, actually harsh but fair sentencing in certain counties where they have harsher drug punishments, they actually experience a lower recidivism rate. So by increasing the sentences, the short-term effect is an increase in the inmates. But then actually over a longer period of time, you have people, around 60% of our prison system is made up of people who are repeat offenders. And by completely eliminating, well, not completely eliminating those, but shrinking that number down dramatically, you will actually see a drop in the prison system, or the number of inmates in our prison system.
Thank you. Anyone care to respond? Yes.
All right, I don't mean to thwart the guidelines of this debate, but we do have time to kill, am I correct? Okay, so I would like to respond to what both my counterparts had said earlier before this question was asked. I really do apologize, Mr. Bonacci, if I came across as not representing the libertarian standpoint. I completely agree that individuals should be left up to themselves to determine whether they pursue rehab or not, and there should be no federal funding for such a program. So I just wanted to clarify that point, and I completely agree. For Mr. Beskin, however, the analogy you made of giving a baby a toy they can choke on, well, I'm not going to guess at your intentions, but to me, it sounds a lot like you're assuming that the average American is too incompetent to know what's right for themselves. And of course, unless they have a medical degree, they may not know what's right for themselves. But that does not mean that their senator does or that their president does. Overall, it is very, as I said, monarchical or just totalitarian to assume that nobody has the right to know what is right for themselves, that they are too incompetent and they need a higher power to tell them what to do and what not to do. It's simply, you cannot legislate ethics, and I thought I made my point the first time, and your analogy only strengthens my argument. So by saying it's unrealistic to have nonpartisan agreement in this issue is frankly just dissenting opinions for the sake of social good. And it is in that vein that the worst mistakes in history have ever been made. It's simply, it's not in the American spirit. And I don't see how a party that claims to support America, that is in this country, can support such a standpoint.
Thank you. Next question is for Mr. Beskin.
Announcement. Students, if you've not pre-registered for the AP, I'll be able to take the AP exam without pre-registering. Thank you.
Our next question for Mr. Beskin. Have you pre-registered for your AP exams? Excellent, thank you. Your platform calls for both the increased use of rehabilitation options when it comes to sentencing individuals convicted of drug-related charges. You also call for increased efforts to combat the supply of illegal drugs entering the United States. I think we all can agree that both these initiatives would be rather costly. How would you prioritize the different changes you are calling for in this day and age when we rarely have a government get exactly what it wants?
Again, this is just a representation of the party's stance, so this isn't a formal proposal of how we would allocate the costs. But to answer your question, we would prioritize funding for things such as the Coast Guard to prevent drugs from getting to the United States in the first place. We want to reduce incarceration rates, not focus on the actual prisons. We want to prevent people from having to go to prison in the first place by reducing the accessibility of drugs and then the want for drugs.
Mr. Bonacci.
Just a question to Mr. Beskin here. Why would the government federally mandate and propose rehabilitation when rehabilitation is proven to have about a 60% relapse rate?
Part of it is that rehab is relatively new within our prison system and that it's still being experimented with. And more recent studies have shown greater impacts with different methods. So for example, simply having medical treatment in rehab is somewhat effective, but additionally having re-entry programs and education is extremely effective. In Boston, it reduced the rearrest rate by 30%, in San Francisco by 83%. It clearly can be more effective than it is right now.
So then in Boston and San Francisco, those are two areas where the best person can guess they're crime-ridden areas. What about a place like the middle of nowhere in Nebraska? You know, do they really need a rehabilitation center if they don't already have the issue? Do they need to spend the government funding? Do they need to spend $50,000, $100,000 in taxpayer money where they don't need that system?
Well, just because it's in a less urban area does not mean that the rehab would be any less successful. And even if fewer people are being incarcerated in other areas, it is simply irrelevant because for the people that are incarcerated and leave prison and don't return, that's still going to be saving taxpayer money in the long run.
Thank you. Mana, 1 minute.
All right. I wanted to touch on the fact that the Democratic Party supports federally funded and mandated rehabilitation, correct? Okay. So by that same logic, should a diabetic or a morbidly obese individual be forced by the government to participate in a more healthy diet? It's the same exact logic. It's the same exact medical concern. But yet that doesn't happen. And we also do not, rehabilitate or imprison alcoholics either, when alcohol has been shown to be much more addictive than many Schedule I drugs, especially marijuana. Now, if you want to go ahead and rebut that, please do, because I simply do not see the logic and the sheer hypocrisy in what is societally accepted and what is legislatively mandated.
Anyone care to respond? Mr. Beskin?
A diabetic is fundamentally different from a drug user in that a diabetic is not a danger to society. People that are on drugs are going to be more dangerous to other people because they have elevated heart rates or hallucinations or various other impacts that make them perhaps eat a man's face off. And that's very different from a diabetic, I'd say. So as a result, we're going to continue our stance that people that are on drugs should try and get help so that they don't return to society and become a danger to other people again.
I wanted to use my interruption just quickly to say, our former Senator Jim Webb of Virginia, Democrat, your party, did say that drug addiction in and of itself is not a crime. It is the consequences of that addiction. Now, to me, it seems that consuming another person's face is the crime, not the fact that he was high. Now, the fact that he consumed a man's face is like violating his right to property, his right to life. Now, that seems to be the crime to me and not the actual drug addiction. We need to crack down on crime and not drug addiction. The fact is, when you legalize drugs, when you make drugs illegal, the crime rate soars. And police sources in major cities do indicate that 50% of property crime is committed by drug users. And not because they're high, and not because they're doing it because it's fun to do when you're on cocaine. That's not the reason. It's because they need to rob these houses in their minds to pay for the illegal drugs on the black market, whose prices are soared because they are illegal. Now, I see 1,000,001 ways to fix this problem through legalization.
Can I just respond to that? I don't mean to come to Ian's defense here, but
Terrorist thought.
Yeah, I showed justice statistics from the Bureau of Justice Statistics that showed that people who have committed drug offenses are fundamentally more they're more probable to commit felonies. It's proven. They have more prior arrests than any other category, and more prior felonies and convictions than any other category. I don't see how you can justify that in your mind.
Now, I believe that's because of the 3 strikes law.
That's your second interruption, just FYI.
Wonderful, thank you, Harris. So I think it's because of the 3 strikes law. In California, if you For example, if you smoke marijuana and you get caught more than thrice, then you're in prison for life. Now, that becomes a felony. Now, it's because of the sentencing, just the arbitration of sentencing, that we have more and more drug users for felonies in prison. It's not because of their inherent wrongness.
So it just happens that they're just really, really high and they're robbing something? I mean, is that what you're suggesting? That a normal person, a sober person, would just randomly go up and rob a bank for the same reasons?
I hate to cut you all off, but we're going to have to move on to the next question. Excuse me. Next question is for Mana and the Young Libertarians. In the prepared research you submitted, you state that, quote, the Drug Enforcement Administration has 10,000 agents, intelligence analysts, and support staff members. Their skills would be much better used if these people were redeployed to full-time counterterrorism investigations. Do you believe that the majority of the American people would favor eliminating the entirety of the Federal Drug Enforcement Administration and abandoning all federal drug laws?
I'm not going to assume anything regarding public opinion because it is not up to me nor anybody else to assume or mandate what millions of people should believe. Though your question was not unjust, I'm just saying. But I have noticed this. In our research, we did state that the agents in the DEA would be better put to use in anti-terrorism efforts. And though that's not an entirely libertarian stance, it is where we can begin. Now, I have noticed this. It's not the cocaine addict's disease that massacres innocent citizens. It is not his disease, perhaps, maybe his homicidal tendencies, even though I cannot cite a single case of that happening. It is not his disease that massacres innocent citizens. It is the terrorist attack, be it the Boston Marathon or 9/11. Now, germane to the discussion of the war on drugs and not the war on terrorism, the constituents of this very state of Virginia, as I stated earlier, elected a man named Jim Webb, who said, as I quote, drug addiction is not in and of itself a criminal act. It is a medical condition, indeed a disease, just as alcoholism is. And we don't lock up alcoholics for being alcoholics. The sole basis for the incarceration of a drug user is simply that because many drugs are illegal. And frankly, just because a law is a law does not mean it's right. A law of this country, not to be cliche, at one point was that you could own somebody, that you could employ them without payment to do your bidding. Now, clearly, this is the justification for questioning our laws. Without questioning our laws, without presenting dissenting opinions, there is no way to have individual rights in this country.
Thank you. We're going to move right along because we have one final question for each of our representatives. Mr. Bonacci, last one's for you. You mentioned that the United States spends around $18.6 million a day to keep undocumented immigrants in our prison system. Do you propose defunding some drug enforcement programs in order to protect the border? And if not, where do you suppose to get the extra funding needed?
Well, to be quite honest with you, if you got rid of that entire prison population, you're not only freeing up our prison system, but you're also freeing up $7 billion in taxpayer money. So whether the states feel that it's necessary to use that for border control, drug enforcement, or even just law enforcement in general, I think it's really it comes down to the states and freeing up that $7 billion.
Thank you. Mr. Beskin, your final question. You state that you are against mandatory minimum sentences for drug offenses since they, quote, take away the flexibility of judges and juries. If you eliminate mandatory minimum sentence for drug offenses, could this move possibly lead to the elimination of mandatory minimum sentences for other crimes, perhaps even capital crimes?
Yes, absolutely. We're essentially against mandatory minimums as a whole because we believe that more often than not, it ends up punishing the wrong people and it punishes those people excessively for the crime committed, and it's disproportionate to what they've done. And instead, the sentences should be adjusted so that it focuses more and penalizes more those who were at the upper tiers of the drug trading and who are the ones behind the scenes, not the ones who are on the street dealing the drugs.
Thank you. Mona, your final question. One of your main arguments, your central tenets, is that you mentioned that the enforcement of federal drug laws costs about $19 billion a year in federal spending. Do you believe that the potentially dramatic societal change that the full legalization of currently illegal drugs would cause is worth saving just 0.004% of the annual federal budget?
That's a really interesting point. I'm glad you asked. So above all, allow me to reiterate the taxation of victimless crimes is the epitome of just throwing money at a problem. It doesn't matter how much money. Even if it's 1/4000th of a percent, it's still a part of our people's liberty. No, there is no insignificant minority. There is no insignificant amount of money that we can take away for a cause that does not need it. So, be it of wasted money and squandered liberty, which manifests itself in wasted tax dollars, the despotic nature of taxation itself, just taking any quantity of an individual's property and throwing it at a drug problem that an individual has is ridiculous. Libertarians believe in a communitarian, not communistic as Mr. Bonacci would propose, but in a communitarian and collective responsibility for the individuals in their society. When you tax the individual, you take away his initiative, his personal responsibility to use his own money as he sees fit in his community, to take personal responsibility for the issues in his community. So this is why we believe in private charity. For so long, because we've been taxed and we've sat back and said, you know, I gave the government so much of my tax dollars, they're going to do as they see fit, and since I elected them, they know what's right. Sitting back and just defaulting in that manner it's gonna lead to the moral decay of our society, for the lack of individual responsibility, of social awareness.
Thank you. We're going to have 1 minute closing statements from each of the representatives. Mr. Bonacci, if you'd like to go first.
All right, so the Young Republicans believe that prison reform, just as Young Democrats and Young Libertarians believe that it is necessary. But we believe that in order to make this happen, we need to free up our federal budget. The easiest way to do that is get rid of the undocumented people in our prison system, free up the $7 billion, and let the states delegate where that money goes to. We're not saying you have to use it on rehabilitation. We're saying you should use it in some way. And if rehabilitation is the best way for you to use it, then so be it. But if you don't need it, we don't think we should delegate it specifically to that purpose. I forfeit my time.
Thank you. Mr. Beskin, 1 minute.
Finally, to say that we should be moving DEA agents into counterterrorism doesn't make any sense, because more people have died in the war on drugs in the past 5 years than have died in the war on terror in the past 10. So as a result, it's clear that drugs are something that need to be regulated. And additionally, if you take away the face of the government, it is still older men and women making decisions. And a big part of it is to protect kids in our society who are unaware of the effects of the drugs. And that's why we want to keep them. The Democratic Party fully stands behind stricter sentencing in certain cases, providing rehab with re-entry programs, and additionally attacking the problem at its core to prevent drugs from getting into our society in the first place so that we can best protect the people of this country.
Thank you. 1 minute.
So just to address their closing statements, everyone, not Mr. Beskin's, Mr. Please, everyone within our borders should be held up to the same standards, citizen or not. That's just the libertarian perspective. And should you want to deport the illegal immigrants in the prison system, where to? To the countries they came from, that they fled due to the violence? Back to Honduras, where the drug problem is even worse? I don't see the morality in that. And one who claims moral absolutism when he is against drug use is clearly just hypocritical if he sees morality in shipping people back to a country even worse off than ours with the drug issue. Now, unregulated drug use, at the end of the day, is a personal liberty, and drug addiction is a personal and medical problem. And it's frankly not my problem, it's not theirs, it's nobody's but the person themselves. And how another exercises their liberty over their life and body, which is their property, is frankly no one's concern but their own, as I stated. So the threat of incarceration will not stop drug use. We've seen that it only increases it.
Alrighty, thank you so much. If we could have a round of applause for all three representatives up here today. Thank you very much for listening, and please enjoy the rest of your case day.
Well, that was a very interesting debate, Fufi. If I had one word to describe it, I would say certainly heated.
Yes, indeed, that is true. Weston, do you know what is not that heated?
What is that, Fufi?
I believe jet fuel. Anyone that is confused, up next, we have the research committee who will be giving us some background, some precedent, and some vocab behind the case. Weston, make sure you pay attention here. This will actually clear up any confusions anyone has. Now, everyone, please give your attention to Ian Beskin and Rachel Wu.
Hi, I'm Ian Beskin.
And I'm Rachel Wu.
And we're representing the research committee today. And before the oral arguments begin, we'd like to go over some of the basic vocab, precedents, and things to know so that everybody can be fully up to date with the arguments. Some of them have been gone over already, but we'll just touch on them briefly before the council. So first of all, the Controlled Substance Analog Enforcement Act and the Controlled Substances Act aren't the same thing. Just be aware that the two are slightly different. The Analog Enforcement Act searches to define what exactly constitutes a controlled substance analog, while the Controlled Substances Act determines how to determine guilt from that point. Additionally, Schedule 1 and 2 drugs are drugs that are explicitly defined by the DEA, things that are put on their website, and things that we all know like methamphetamine and cocaine. A controlled substance analog, which is at the heart of this case, is a substance that is substantially similar to one of these Schedule 1 or 2 drugs. And finally, scienter or mens rea is knowingly intending to break the law. So that's something that will likely come up. To go over some of the facts of the case and how this originated, McFadden was originally selling these, he created these bath salts. And these aren't anything like the traditional bath salts. These are really just a substance with an arbitrary term, bath salts. And they are very much drugs. In fact, McFadden himself actually compared them to methamphetamine and cocaine on a phone call. McFadden looked on the DEA website and he didn't find any of the compounds listed there in his bath salt. So as a result, he thought it would be perfectly legal to sell them. Later, when certain compounds were added onto that list, McFadden flushed his bath salts down the toilet and stopped selling them, believing that it would now be illegal to do so. McFadden was nevertheless tried in Virginia.
After he was convicted for distributing as a violation for the Analog Act, he petitioned. However, the Fourth Circuit reaffirmed the original district court's decision. In January of this year, the Supreme Court granted writ, and on April 21st, 2015, arguments will occur. An important part of the roadmap to the Supreme Court is a circuit court split, and this is where different geographic regions of district courts have different decisions. So on McFadden's side, you have 2nd, 7th, and 8th, Roberts, Turcotte, and Sullivan. And on the government side, you have 4th, Klecker and McLam, and 5th, DeSura and Dow. To just explain what each of these is like, I'll just give a quick summary of one from each. So for the 8th Circuit Court, U.S. v. Sullivan, for conviction, the jury was required to find that 1, Sullivan possessed a controlled substance analog, in this case mephedrone, and 2, that Sullivan knew that he was in possession of a controlled substance analog, and 3, that Sullivan intended to distribute the controlled substance analog for human consumption. According to the 8th Circuit, the Controlled Substance Analog Enforcement Act does not require the DEA to classify a substance as a controlled substance analog before it can take action. And it instructed that a reasonable juror could infer that because Sullivan indicated that his bath powder was illegal, he knew that the powder contained a controlled substance analog. And on the other side for the United States government, something that we've already heard a lot this morning is that the Controlled Substance Analog Act is very vague. An important part of that is that there is a void for vagueness challenge. To satisfy the Fifth Amendment's due process requirements, a penal statute must define the criminal offense, 1, with sufficient definitively that ordinary people can understand what conduct is prohibited, and 2, in a manner that does not encourage arbitrary and discriminatory enforcement. And that's an important part of the Fourth Circuit Court cases.
To go over some of the basic arguments that we'll hear from the council later on, McFadden, the petitioner, will likely argue that he couldn't have known that the substances he possessed were illegal. He believes that he did everything in his power. He looked on the DEA website and couldn't find anything suggesting that his substances were illegal. And along with that, he argues that the phrase substantially similar is unconstitutionally vague and unrecognized by the scientific community. As presented by Noah and Andrew earlier on, it's very vague what substantially similar means. And McFadden says that because not even the government or the scientific community knows what this term means, it shouldn't be applied to a layperson who doesn't have any particular knowledge in the field of chemistry. Furthermore, McFadden will likely argue that the government must prove that the defendant knows similar chemical structure of an analog to a controlled substance. So McFadden is essentially saying that not only do you need to prove intent for human consumption, you need to prove that the person selling or distributing the substances knew of the similar chemical structure and effects of the drug. And finally, a case that will likely come up that is very related to this case, but not involving analog drugs, is Staples v. United States. In Staples, the opinion of the court was that Staples could not be tried for having a possession of a machine gun if he did not know that it was a machine gun and instead believed that it was a rifle.
On the other hand, the respondent will examine the Controlled Substances Analog Enforcement Act and argue that Congress included only 3 express mens rea requirements for distribution, human consumption, and a similar physical or mental effect to a Schedule 1 or 2 drug on the user. However, there are 2 other prongs without such a requirement: similar chemical structure and a similar physical or mental effect to any controlled substance. Because Congress included a mens rea requirement in some areas and not others, it can thus be assumed, applying previous Supreme Court precedents, that Congress omitted with intention, and that a defendant does not need to know whether a drug has a similar chemical structure to a controlled substance. Applying the scienter requirement to a controlled substance analog is nonsensical, since controlled substance analogs are by definition not controlled substances. Indeed, whether or not a substance is an analog is determined by the jury. Proving that the defendant knew of a substantially similar chemical structure would significantly curtail the government's ability to prosecute distributors and execute the law. We hope that you now have more knowledge of the case and are prepared to hear oral arguments. Thank you.
That was That was very informative indeed. Thank you to Ian and Rachel, and especially thank you to Ian for the back-to-back debate and discussion. The debate was indeed the highlight. Weston, would you like to introduce our newest guest speaker?
Yes, sir. So now we have a special treat, another guest speaker today, Mr. John Skrbanski, a DEA section chief. Mr. Skrbanski has done about it all in the DEA. He has worked throughout the area in the DEA since 1991 as a special agent and was promoted to supervisory special agent in 2003. In 2008, Skrbanski then became the unit chief of the pharmaceutical investigations section of the headquarters in Arlington, the DEA headquarters in Arlington, where he worked to stop the diversion of pharmaceutically controlled substances. Now working as a section chief since 2012, Mr. Skrbanski oversees and coordinates major precursor chemical, clandestine laboratory, and synthetic designer drug investigations. Please give a warm welcome to Mr. John Skrbanski.
Good morning, and thank you for inviting me here today. Where to begin? I already saw some very heated debates and some very good research done, and I hope to add to that and give you a little bit of background on what we're doing with DEA. I do have a PowerPoint I need to load up. I'm much more interested with pictures, so if you don't mind, and maybe somebody could help me with this, I'd appreciate it. It's on Langley B.
Okay.
While that's queuing up, I'll just, it's not really part of my presentation, but really the DEA and all of drug law enforcement, the White House, the Office of National Drug Control Policy, really believes that addressing this, the drug abuse problem from multiple angles, and it's really, we want to prevent it through education. We want to prevent drug use before it happens. Another big part of that is treatment, and those that are addicted and have a abuse disorder, we feel that they need to be receive treatment for that. And then the other component of that is enforcement, and really that's part of the prevention area. So, and where I am. Langley B. And just a little bit more background. Like was mentioned before, I'm in the what's called the Office of Diversion Control program, and that program really monitors pharmaceutical drug abuse and the distribution of pharmaceutical drugs, as well as the synthetic designer drug issue. Thank you. Yep. So my presentation here this morning is really going to address synthetic designer drugs and how we're encountering them in the United States and what we're seeing. And while I think this kind of plays into a little bit about what you're doing with the courses, the cases that are going to the Supreme Court, give you some background. A lot of this information is actually presented at trials of these controlled substance analog cases. So hopefully you'll find this helpful, and I'll also put in some education pieces as well as to show the harms of these types of substances. One thing I want to mention is that this is not a problem that's unique to the United States. It's a worldwide problem. More than 95 different countries are experiencing what they call is problems with NPS, new psychoactive substances. This is a report that's put out by the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, and they track that. And again, when they talk about new psychoactive substances, we kind of refer to them here as non-controlled synthetic designer drugs. And when I say non-controlled, they're not under US scheduling, and these ones internationally are not under international control as well. Since 2009, the U.S. has seen more than 250 of these synthetic designer drugs enter the U.S. market. They're sold as synthetic cannabinoids. We see more than 100 compounds of synthetic cannabinoids, more than 50 synthetic cathinones, what you have been referring to as bath salts, and 90 other compounds as well. We'll talk about those as the presentation continues. The synthetic designer drugs that I'm going to talk about are perceived as legal alternatives to drugs like marijuana, cocaine, methamphetamine, LSD, PCP, and now heroin. We're seeing synthetic analogs of opioids as well. The drugs are sold as incense and potpourri, bath salts, glass cleaner, shoe deodorizer, plant food, Molly, and many other names. And now we're seeing a substance that's being sold with the street name of Flock, and I'll describe that later. One I think that you guys are concentrating on are the synthetic cathinones, the bath salts and plant food and glass cleaners. These are the drugs, and I think you've probably already heard, that are structurally and pharmacologically related to drugs like amphetamines or ecstasy, MDMA. They're central nervous system stimulants, and they also at high dosages provide a psychoactive effect as well. The synthetic cathinones, like all the other drugs, come from an unregulated and unlicensed industry. The full disclosure of what's in these packages are not present on the packet, and we're seeing significant batch-to-batch variances or hotspots with these types of drugs. They're sold in head shops, gas stations, convenience stores, and they're abused like traditional illicit drugs. This substance right here is a synthetic cathinone. It was sold as a plant food, and a half a gram was selling for about $40. And I'll describe that later. I think it's important to know, where they come from and how are they processed and get into the U.S. market. These substances are often coming into the U.S. in packages like this, and this was labeled as a pigment for a paint. It's a powder substance. This comes into the country. It's already a finished product. It's a finished drug. It's got that psychoactive properties that we're all aware of. In this one, it was a drug called MDPV, also 4-methylethylcathinone, and then a cannabinoid, JWH-122. And then they get packaged into products like this. This is an all-purpose, what they call an all-purpose cleaner, and it's a half a gram. And again, this half a gram goes for about $30 to $40 on the market. They've got it labeled on here, not for human consumption and keep out of the reach of children, which is understandable, but it contains the drug alpha PVP, which was, I believe, in the McFadden case as well. And another example of a synthetic cathinone, this is sold as 8 balls, again, a glass cleaner. And when I talked about variances and different types of substances that are found in the same packaging, we've got 3 different purchases that we made of this drug, half a gram. Each one contained a different drug in it. Pentalone and pentadrone, alpha BBP, fluoromethamphetamine, benzocaine, and caffeine in the top one. Pentalone, fluoromethamphetamine, alpha PVP, benzocaine, and caffeine in the second one. And then the third one, even different, alpha PVP, pentalone, benzocaine, and caffeine. You just don't know what you're going to get when you buy a product like this, but they all have a psychoactive substance in them. And then an example of a bath salt. Again, the product contained the drug alpha PVP and alpha BVP. Both of those have since been scheduled in the United States. Oftentimes in trials, the prosecutors will do a cost comparison of these types of drugs. We've got a real plant food, really 1.5 pounds of plant food that you can buy from your home goods store and selling for $5.98 each. And this receives a 4-star or a 5-star rating. So let's look at the other plant food I described earlier below. And this is a half a gram of a drug that's labeled as plant food and not for human consumption. That's sold for a half gram for $40. When you do the math here, 453 grams per pound in the for doing the all-purpose real plant food. And so you've got about 680 grams in real plant food above the equivalent cost. Do we have any guesstimates in the audience what that was going to be for if you wanted to buy 1.5 pounds of below plant food? $54,000, 400. So again, these products are being disguised in what you and I would not buy from the store, but people that want to abuse a psychoactive substance and find something that they perceive to be legal, this is what they're buying in the stores. The adverse health effects to abusing or using these types of substances is significant. I've highlighted a few, but there are a lot of medical issues that go along with that, but there are also psychological problems. And somebody had discussed a little bit of that before: aggressive behavior, auditory and visual hallucinations, paranoia, self-mutilation, suicidal ideation. And it goes on and on. And those who are using these types of substances, hallucinate and create significant problems in society, not just to their own person. There's been research on these types of substances as well. This research was conducted by the Virginia Commonwealth University, studied the effects of bath salts. And one of their findings is that the bath salts are not only addictive, but the effects to the central nervous system may be irreversible. Synthetic cathinones have kind of moved a little bit from being sold in the retail environments of like a gas station or a convenience store, and we're now finding them being sold in the illicit market like traditional illicit drugs. They're often encapsulated or tabletized. They're often sold as powder. When we're encountering these, this drug was being sold as Molly. It's kind of a popular nickname for an MDMA or ecstasy type drug. But that drug right there was a drug called methylone. It was not scheduled at the time that we had seized it. And now we're finding drugs that are being sold under the street name of Flocka and causing, again, the significant issues of synthetic cathinones. I wanted to point out some of the drugs that we found that were sold as Molly. Again, a popular street name for drugs. MDMA was the original Molly type drug, and that was scheduled in 1985. When we've encountered many other drugs like methylone, alpha PVP, 4-methyl-ethylcathinone, pentadrone, butylone, ethylone, and others being sold as Molly. And again, these are drugs that when you buy something, you're not knowing what you're receiving at the time. When you look at MDMA versus methylone, and you may have already discussed this earlier this morning, and this is some of the evidence that gets presented in trials, is the chemical structure and how these drugs look at. So when you look at MDMA compared to methylone, there's really not much difference between the two substances. And this is something that I think was brought up before, is often debated in court by chemical experts. Another issue that's brought up, and I've mentioned it, is the health consequences. Again, talking about Molly and drugs for MDMA and methylone. There was a recent outbreak, and this one at the top kind of hits close to home. Miss Goldsmith was a Jefferson Scholar at the University of Virginia. So again, instances where people who may take one of these drugs on a one-time occurrence have significant consequences. Some of the other synthetic drugs of abuse that we're seeing, phenethylamines, or drugs like 2,25-I-N-bomb. These are sold as substitutes for LSD. We've seen significant overdoses as well as deaths related to this drug. These three substances were scheduled by the DEA in November of 2013. The synthetic opioids are becoming a huge issue right now. You're probably aware of a lot of the heroin overdoses that are occurring throughout the United States. And one of the reasons behind that is the drug fentanyl and acetylfentanyl. Acetylfentanyl is actually an analog of fentanyl, but we're finding this drug mixed in with heroin batches and also being sold in pill form. Had a significant seizure out of Canada back in May of 2013. And again, this is causing the rise in overdose deaths related to heroin abuse. Again, looking at the chemical structure of acetylfentanyl versus fentanyl and the difference there. Back in March and April of 2013, there was a series of overdose deaths up in Rhode Island, in a small radius of Rhode Island, that was related to this product here, acetylfentanyl. The other class of drug I wanted to talk about is synthetic cannabinoids, and the same issue about the chemical structure comes into play with the synthetic cannabinoids as well. These are the drugs that are in the chemical compound of the marijuana plant that are structurally related. The synthetic cannabinoids may or may not have the similar effect of THC in marijuana, but they're depressants and hallucinogens. People who are using these are also hallucinating on these products. But the psychoactive substance is laced on the plant material and then smoked. And I'll describe that a little bit further detail in a minute. The Spice and K2 products were generally the main brand names for synthetic cannabinoids that first came onto the market. They're sold under many different names as well. We've got, again, over 95 to 100 different compounds related to synthetic cannabinoids. And these drugs are often mistaken with legal marijuana or synthetic marijuana. And it's because they're abused by smoking, and I think the appearance. But when you really analyze this substance, it really comes down to it's more of a hallucinogen and more similar to a drug like PCP than it is to marijuana. Again, these come from unregulated and unlicensed industries, significant batch-to-batch variances. We're still encountering these drugs in head shops and convenience stores and gas stations. Often the owners have moved them from behind the counter so law enforcement won't detect them in their stores. And again, they're labeled not for human consumption. That kind of tries to give them a defense for the Controlled Substance Analog Act. Again, inconsistencies in product. This was a herbal potpourri, or at least it was sold as an herbal potpourri, 1.5 grams. And down in the bottom, they've got a warning for the potpourri extra potent blend that we'd like to point out. But again, if you make 4 different purchases, you'll find 4 different types of drugs, and even a multiple drugs laced on the product. The top one had both JWH 122 and AM 2201 compound in it, and then the other ones had different compounds as well. Again, what does this look like when it comes into the country, and how is it transformed into a usable form? And I think that's pretty important to realize how this is abused. This product was JWH 081, and it came into the country as a research chemical. Again, when you talk to any legitimate researcher, they'll tell you they only need a few grams to do legitimate research on a product like this. But here, 1,000 grams of JWH 081 comes into the country. That'll make anywhere between 10 to 15 kilograms of usable product. So that 1 kilogram of powder will turn into about 15 kilograms of usable product. So they take that powder and they have to solubilize it, and they'll mix it with an acetone. And this was a location that we encountered, 5-gallon drums of acetone. And they'll get a plant-like material. This is something called Damiana, and it's got really no hallucinogenic effects or no psychoactive effects. But they use that as a medium, and they'll take that solution of both the acetone and the synthetic cannabinoid, they'll mix it together. And they'll put it in a cement mixer like this. And this is probably one of the nicer locations that we've encountered that was making synthetic cannabinoid into a usable product. They'll add flavoring really to try to dull the taste because it's very harsh taste as you're abusing this product. And then they'll dump it on a warehouse floor like they did here. What they're doing, they're letting the acetone evaporate. And you'll see the fans blowing the acetone away from the substance as it evaporates, and what's left is that psychoactive substances laced on the plant material. And then we'll go to a warehouse like this, where you'll have anywhere between 15 and 20 people packaging their products into these type of foil packets for distribution all throughout the United States. This was probably one of the nicer ones that we've encountered here in the US. We also encounter these type of processing centers in people's sheds, their garages. Again, another shed here. And then they're sold in locations like this. This Exxon gas station was in, I believe, New Jersey. And then this head shop, a good case study is called The Last Place on Earth out of Minnesota. And again, that was a controlled substance analog case in The Last Place on Earth. This owner was given numerous opportunities and warnings about selling these types of products, and he chose to ignore them. There was a search warrant, and he actually went to trial and was convicted, I think, of 51 of 54 different counts of the Controlled Substance Analog Act. We're also seeing the synthetic cannabinoids delivered in a different type of way. It's a liquid it's vaporized in these e-cigarettes. And again, there's no reason for a product like AB Pinaca or 5-fluoro-UR-144 to be in these type of products, other than for somebody to abuse them and get high. Again, another example of this liquid incense that you can go in refillable cigarettes. Some of the latest compounds that we're encountering is AB Pinaca and AB Fubinaca, and those were found in these products. Again, the price of these is significantly higher than what you would pay for incense. I'll go through this again. This is kind of a cost comparison, again, that might be used in trial. For a real bag of potpourri, again, in my taste, it's probably a little bit expensive, $26 online for a bag of potpourri. That's 12 ounces. But when you look at a substance that's being sold as Scooby Snacks, that is, I believe, a 4-gram bag and was sold for $25. And again, while the cost isn't quite as different as what it was with the synthetic cannabinoids and the plant food blow, it still goes for $2,100 if you're going to buy the equivalent amount of potpourri. This kind of goes to a little bit about the perception of drugs and the availability. And I think the synthetic cannabinoids and cathinones kind of gives you a good example of what happens if there are products that are legalized and what's going to happen, who's going to abuse them. And there's a study done by the University of Maryland that just says that synthetic marijuana is more popular among teens than most drugs. And I think that goes to availability. If you can go down to your corner store and buy that, then there's a good chance you'll do it. If it's not being sold in the store, it's not going to be available, so it won't tempt you to do that. Again, talking about some of the collateral damage, this was a person who smoked one of the first chemical compounds out there, JW8018. He was a 16-year-old, basically sped by his school, wrecked his car. They did a drug test on him, and the only thing in his system was his substance, JW8018. And they also tested the pipe in the car. But again, it's not the damage that you're doing to yourself, although it is, but it's also the damage that you're doing to society. Beyond the overdoses, there are significant psychological problems that can occur with the abuse of these drugs. This person, his name is Kyle Smith. I've met his mother. He had used the synthetic cannabinoids starting at the age of 15, bought it from a Shell gas station not far from his house. Meeting with his mom, he's been in and out of inpatient hospital treatment for the abuse of synthetic cannabinoids for psychiatric assistance. Again, the cannabinoids cause many of the same problems that the cathinones do. So you can't look at the synthetic cannabinoids and say it's compared to synthetic marijuana. It's still significant, and there have been multiple deaths and overdoses that have been associated with this type of drug. Again, the public safety concerns, if you go online, I'm sure many of you probably already have, you can find just incident after incident of public safety concerns, hospital visits, overdoses related to that. Some of the ones that we've seen, but there are many more. In Mississippi, self-mutilation, Iowa, man eats dirt, New Jersey, pre-stab, Pennsylvania, stabbing of a friend. Maine, man sees people coming out of a mattress arrested with a rifle. Couple hallucinates burglary and shoots up their own house. A naked car chaser, high in bath salts, and suicide. And again, those aren't, it may seem bizarre and not a rare occurrence, but it happens quite often. I point this out, again, it's something that I've been in contact with Veronica Eckhart there. That's her son, Connor, who was a one-time user of synthetic cannabinoids back in July of 2014. Their website is thedirtiestkeptsecret.org, and I really encourage everybody to go to that website. It's a great educational tool to learn about the hazard of these products. All right. Legislation, I'm kind of move through here quickly because there's been numerous substances that have been temporarily scheduled, and then also Congress has also scheduled them. But why is it hard for law enforcement to keep up? And this is kind of a short timeline of what we've seen going back to November of 29 and a sequence up to February 2013. Obviously, that goes beyond that. But if you look at these chemical compounds, as soon as the substance is either temporarily scheduled or we are able to address it through our analog act, a new compound comes out, and that's kind of what this represents. So that leads us to the Controlled Substance Analog Act, and the students that were up here before me did an excellent job in describing what that is. But this is a tool that we use to help address people that are poisoning our communities with these types of products, really with a disregard to society. That case I mentioned, The Last Place on Earth, he was warned numerous times to stop selling the product. The city put an injunction against him. He ignored it. He kept selling it. Again, we use this Controlled Substance Analog Act to address his drug sales in that community. It was a community health hazard. He was really affecting the public safety and well-being of that area. And many of the individuals in that area were grateful when his store was shut down. We've had 3 coordinated law enforcement efforts. We've tucked a few in between a lot of those. But I'm going to discuss one of them. It's called Operation Logjam, and we primarily use the Controlled Substance Analog Act to address that. And it just kind of discusses the severity and the depth of the problem regarding synthetic designer drugs. This Operation Logjam took place back in July of 2012. Yes, July of 2012. We executed 300 search warrants related to those that were selling these types of products. And I'm just going to point out a couple of the numbers right here. 4.8 million packets of synthetic cannabinoid seeds, 1,900 pounds of raw synthetic powder. That's the powder that's coming into the country before it gets laced onto the plant material. And then 10,000 pounds of treated plant material. And then more than $45 million in U.S. currency that was derived from the sale of these types of drugs. I'd like to put a number on that 4.8 million packets, and just to show you, how much money is generated. And so 4.8 million, just if you were to say $10 a unit, that's $48 million. There's 1,900 pounds of the synthetic cannabinoid compound prepackaged, $45 million. And then for the plant material, another 23 million. The total, if you were to put a dollar figure on that, just to show you why people are doing this, it's really all about the money and not about providing society with a decent product. The synthetic cathinones, just about $20 million in synthetic cathinones were seized as well during that one operation. Some of the seizures that were involved in this, and again, if you go down to the safe in the lower left corner, well over $1 million in U.S. currency generated from the sale of this type of product. There's something called the Monitoring the Future Survey, and they kind of tracked high school seniors. This goes back to 2012, where 1 in 9 high school seniors had admitted to using this type of product. Hospital emergency room admissions, the Drug Abuse Warning Network, it's no longer collecting this type of data. But again, to show you the widespread amount of public harm and society harm that occurred just in a short time. In 2010, there were more than 11,000 emergency room visits as a result of the abuse of these types of drugs for the synthetic cannabinoids. And that almost tripled going up to 2011. In 2010, they didn't keep stats on the bath salt type data, but they kept it the following year, and there were more than 22,000. Unfortunately, the funding went away for that type of report, and that was the last year that they collected that data. Again, showing the overdoses, Georgia, 2013, Colorado, more than 221 people went to the emergency room. This was, I believe, Jackson or Gainesville, Florida. And most recently, there's been a big outbreak down in Alabama, Texas. There's even been an outbreak in Virginia regarding the abuse of synthetic cannabinoids. I mentioned this at the beginning. Really, prevention and education is so important when dealing with any type of drug issue. but this one as well. When people and parents don't understand what these products are all about, what type of drugs are hidden in these types of products, it's very important that we address it that way, and as well as the enforcement issue, the enforcement component. So the 2013 Monitoring the Future survey, I was happy to see, looks a little bit better. 1 in 13 high school seniors had admitted to using the synthetic cannabinoids, but again, in my opinion, that's way too high. And food for thought, I'm just about done here. These manufacturers and distributors really need to be held accountable when their sole concern is making a dollar and supplying these types of products with disregard to our health and safety. And really, people like you, at your age group, those who are trying to avoid a drug detection, are turning to these types of products and really harming the public safety and well-being of society. We've got a couple of web-based resources, getsmartaboutdrugs.com and justthinktwiceabout.com. But again, I would urge you to go to the dirtiestkeptsecret.org website, as it's truly putting out a lot of education regarding these types of substances. And I think that puts me in under the wire, so thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Shabansky. All right, now we have a few questions, I believe, for you. Brian?
Just tweet it out.
Alrighty, our first question comes from Aiden Toole, and he asks, has the availability of analog drugs diminished the demand for controlled substances?
That's a good question. I think it's increased a new user population. This is opening up drug availability to people that would more than likely not try illicit drugs. And that's one of the things that we're seeing. Has it decreased the illicit use? To a certain extent. I think there's some drugs that are probably being abused less because people are turning to these types of drugs because they're hard to detect in drug screenings.
Alrighty, the next question comes from Brian Riley, and he writes, the general perception of drug dealers is not exactly analogous to the general perception of chemists. Are the drug dealers the one engineering these synthetic drugs?
Yeah, we're finding that the non-controlled synthetic designer drugs, the ones that are selling these are requesting chemists in kind of foreign areas, East Asia, to design and develop a drug that is not a controlled substance in other countries. And the ones that are selling that here in the United States are directing those chemists on substances to develop. So they're constantly looking for new analogs or controlled they're looking for new types of drugs that are not controlled, whether it be the international market or here in the United States.
Alrighty, that leads us well into our next question from Ryan Shaw, who asks, how great of a problem are analog drugs in the US compared to the other countries?
The U.S. is kind of comparable to Europe. I'm involved in kind of working groups with that international body, the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, as well as a group called the International Narcotics Control Board. The U.S. and Europe are kind of the trendsetters in these drugs, and other countries generally follow suit. So unfortunately, we're out ahead of many of the countries in the world. Europe has tended to be the same, and like I said, these drugs often come here untested in other markets, and unfortunately we're the ones that are the human guinea pigs with these types of substances.
Alrighty, our next question coming from Cyrus Moe is, if marijuana is legalized, how difficult do you think regulating its much more harmful analog substances would be?
Let me see if I can regulate. I guess regulating would be the equivalent of enforcing. I don't know if that's the regulating. It has a couple of different meanings, especially within DEA, is that we regulate the pharmaceutical and chemical industry. So I'll take that as enforcing the Controlled Substance Analog Act. Let's see. Regarding marijuana versus these controlled substance analogs, from a federal standpoint, we're not addressing individual users of marijuana. So for us, whether or not that occurs won't affect our addressing the controlled substance analogs. The marijuana issue is something that is highly debated. Right now, every other drug in the United States that's approved for medical use is done so by the FDA. The FDA has not approved marijuana as a medicine. So while the general public might vote in favor of legalizing marijuana for medical use, it has not been approved by the FDA like every other medicine.
Alrighty, next question coming from Vivian Baith is, where did the creation of synthetic drugs originate?
Another good question. There was legitimate research that was done many years ago regarding some of the synthetic cannabinoids. That research was done by colleges and universities, but they were found not to have a medicinal purpose, so that information was tabled. However, unscrupulous chemists kind of dug up that research and developed or basically copied the patent on those types of drugs and are producing them internationally. The one substance I mentioned earlier, JWH-018, I believe was developed by a researcher out of Clemson University by the name of John W. Huffman. That's where JWH comes from. And again, many of the initial drugs were developed by legitimate research, but were found to have no legitimate medical purpose, so they were tabled.
Alrighty, our next question sent in to us by Garrett Walsh asks, has the availability of analog drugs diminished the demand for controlled substances?
I think kind of going back to how I kind of talked about that one earlier, I think it's created a new abuser population. Those that may not have tried a controlled substance drug like either marijuana or cocaine turned to something that they thought was safe and legal that was being sold in stores. And again, created a new abuser population. It may have had some effect on the illicit drugs, but overall, I would say not.
Alrighty, our last question submitted by Simone Onwala asks, which controlled substances are most commonly altered as an analog drug?
The ones that we're encountering most are the synthetic cannabinoids. They're the ones that I talked about last, and I think those are the ones that people tend to abuse the most because they equate those to marijuana, and it looks like marijuana. It's abused like marijuana, it's smoked. However, the effects are significantly different. The drugs like the synthetic cathinones, you have a lot of crossover from people who are abusing drugs like methamphetamine that would move to a drug like the bath salts. But the ones that we're seeing most abused are the synthetic cannabinoids.
All right, unfortunately, we are out of time. I'd like to thank you all for submitting questions, and I'd like to give out a special thanks to Mr. John Stravinsky for giving us that wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
The Associate Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States. Oh yay, oh yay, oh yay. All persons having business before the Honorable Supreme Court of the United States are admonished to draw near and give their attention, for the court is now sitting. God save the United States and the Honorable Supreme Court.
McFadden versus the United States of America. Ms. Shaw.
Mr. Chief Justice, Associate Justices, may it please the court. I am Madeline Shaw. I represent the petitioner in the case of McFadden versus the United States. The Court of Appeals erred in affirming the decision of the district court. It is necessary to prove the defendant was aware the substance he was distributing was an analog of a controlled substance. A narrow scientific requirement, such as the human consumption element in the case of McFadden, ignores the intent element for an analog conviction as set forth in the Controlled Substances Act. The Analog Act itself does not directly criminalize anything. It merely provides the definition for what constitutes an analog and refers it to the Controlled Substances Act for the purposes of conviction.
If we look at the plain text of the law, the Controlled Substance Act, the Controlled Substance Analog Act criminalizes possession of a controlled substance knowingly knowing that it satisfies either prong 1, 2, or the third prong. In the controlled substance analog definition, there is an express mens rea for the distribution of human consumption. In your argument, you are extending the mens rea throughout the definition. Can you please explain why?
Well, with regards to the human consumption element, that is certainly part of what would qualify a substance as an analog, and it would be included in the jury instruction. However, there may be mens rea elements which apply to different aspects of the crime, and in this case, the mens rea requirement within the Controlled Substances Act has to be applied to the Analog Act. On this point, the United States government and the petitioner are in agreement. So the Controlled Substances Act requires prosecution to prove that the defendant knowingly or intentionally manufactured and distributed a controlled substance, or in this case, an analog.
And counsel, is it clear to you that this act is intended to apply equally throughout the entire chain of the production and distribution of the analog? That is, it's not aimed only at the producers, but at the distributors and retailers as well.
Well, of course, it may apply to anyone along the supply line that meets the mens rea requirement as established within the Controlled Substances Act. However, when the act was enacted in 1986, it frequently refers to those chemists who are creating the drug so as to get to the source and eliminate these.
But would you concede that the text of the act upon which you want to focus your argument does cover not just the chemists, but the entire chain of distribution?
Yes, absolutely, if they meet that mens rea requirement.
So what is it that you think that needs to be known by the defendant? If he's distributing an analog, what does he have to know to be convicted?
The defendant would have to have knowledge of the qualities of the substance he is distributing that meet the definition of an analog.
Could you quickly define what you mean by qualities?
Yes, absolutely. So the defendant must have knowledge of the structural similarity in chemical structure.
Don't you think that's maybe a little bit excessive to, convict a dealer? They would have to know that the substance they have has a certain chemical structure. Do you think that's maybe a little bit of, excessive?
It is supported by the plain text of the act, and whether it is or is not.
Counselor, based upon your assertion, how could anyone who's not a chemist be convicted under the act?
Well, there are steps that the petitioner understands the concerns of this court that it would make it very difficult in some instances.
Wouldn't it be a higher burden than just a regular controlled substance? I mean, many people that distribute heroin or cocaine, they don't know the chemical analysis of the drug. So you're saying that this would be a higher burden. That's what you would like us to find.
It is a higher burden simply because of the nature of analogs and how they differ from controlled substances. It is only necessary to prove that a defendant in a controlled substances case had knowledge of the identity because controlled substances are published in schedules. So it is
Counsel,
very...
in this case, the actions of the petitioner, it seemed to indicate that he had a sense that he was doing something wrong in the way in which he was carrying out his business. Doesn't this then presume that he knew that this was an analog and that perhaps he really was dealing in a controlled substance?
Not necessarily, because the substance's status as an analog is something that can only be determined at trial. So whether or not someone had a suspicion that the substance is an analog does not necessarily say that it is or is not, because that is determined on a trial basis.
Couldn't you infer from somebody's claims that they make to friends or other distributors that they had knowledge? If they say this is something that is like meth or like heroin or like cocaine, couldn't you then infer that they had knowledge that it was substantially similar to the cocaine or heroin?
Well, that is what the government is asking for, but just simply having knowledge of the effects of a substance does not necessarily constitute knowledge that it is an analog, because it has to meet that kind
But
of...
in McFadden's case, he actually compared the effects of the substance he was dealing to methamphetamine, a controlled substance. So does that not warrant that he is actually intending to distribute a controlled substance?
Well, in the case of McFadden, he is simply not the most sympathetic defendant, but simply having knowledge of that does not constitute, under the text of the Analog Act that provides the definition and the mens rea requirement that is necessarily extended from the Controlled Substances Act.
Counsel, do you think your client, unsympathetic as he may be, thought that he was selling bath salts for hundreds of dollars an ounce? Didn't he know he was selling something that he was purporting to be a drug analog?
Well, purporting to be an analog is not the same thing as actually being an analog. And in the case of McFadden...
But if it wasn't a drug analog, isn't he guilty of fraud?
Well, he didn't represent it to be an analog.
So what you're saying is as long as it has the same effects but not the same structure and they don't know the structure, then you can't try them. So that's what you're saying?
Well, you can certainly try them, but it would be extremely difficult because they do not have that knowledge of the chemical
So you
similarity.
can't really try them, is what you're saying?
It seems to me that your client that the facts of this case point to the exact problem at issue here, which is he was one step ahead of the government. He knew exactly what he was doing. He may not have been a chemist. He may not have known exactly what the chemical composition of the substance was, but he did know that he was that the compound was being altered so that it would never be on the analog list. So how does under your test and what you're asking the court to do, how do you address the problem, which I think we'll all agree is a legitimate governmental interest in keeping these analog drugs off the street? Under your test, it seems to me that it makes prosecution of this type of offense nearly impossible. How does your test address that?
You mentioned an analog list, and that is exactly the problem. There is no analog list. And petitioner does understand the concern for public safety, which is why there are steps the government can take, should it choose to do so, in making it much easier to prosecute those individuals who may not have definitive knowledge of the qualities of the substance that make it illegal. Namely, the DEA possesses a emergency scheduling power, which can make any substance a controlled substance itself, not an analog, in 30 days. And the government can also use the confiscation power to take these drugs off the market and protect those citizens of the
So what would you do after
And then
you
a defendant or a alleged criminal, drug dealer, can then just simply modify that synthetic, the chemical composition of that drug in such a way that it is no longer the same drug that has just been put on the controlled substance list?
Just tweak it once every 30 days.
Well, that
And then are
would
you
say-
saying the defense would be deliberate ignorance? All you have to do is, if you want to be a drug dealer, just make sure you didn't understand the chemical composition. Then you can always walk into court and say, I thought it would get you high, but I didn't know that it was the same chemically, and therefore you can't convict me? Would that be the defense?
No, that would not be the defense, because willful ignorance is no excuse. But in the case of analogs, it is extremely difficult for the ordinary person, such as McFadden, to determine what is or is not considered to be.
So how
an
would
illegal
you go
controlled
about
substance.
proving knowledge? I mean, proving that someone knows something is, very, very difficult. How would you suggest doing that at all in any case?
Well, if you target the chemists, who are the principal targets of the act itself, then they do meet that.
But you said it's
requirement.
not just the chemists. This statute is designed to go after the distributors as well. How are we going to get them?
Well, if the distributors had knowledge of the substances, were informed by the chemists who distributed
But
the
what if
drugs
they
to them.
don't have knowledge? This is the issue. They have the drug, they know what it does, but they don't know what the structure is. Are you saying that you just don't try them and you don't go after them? You just take the drug and let them go?
Well, no, and that would be where the government would use those powers, as I mentioned, such as the emergency scheduling
But
power. or
wouldn't the
compensation.
practical effect be that this statute could only be affected through the emergency powers that it grants, and the other aspects of this statute would have no practical effect were we to undertake your test?
Well, no, because you could still target those people who do meet the mens rea requirement, but should the government become extremely concerned about the difficulty in prosecuting defendants who do not believe, who they believe do not have this knowledge, this act was enacted in 1986 and conditions have changed. Congress could modify the law to make it easier for defendants to be convicted if they do not have that knowledge.
You mentioned that times have changed. Isn't it also easier for drug manufacturers to change the composition of drugs based upon the changes in technology as well?
Well, not necessarily, and that would be highly chemical, but the government claims that adopting the petitioner's method will make convictions under the Analog Act more difficult, and this is not necessarily the case. The Seventh Circuit under Turcotte, which is more similar to what the petitioner is asking for than the government, has not seen any difficulty in convicting street-level dealers regularly while having this knowledge
I would
requirement.
just like to point out the statistics you're listing are actually, they both include controlled substances and their analogs themselves. So that's a combination of both controlled substances and the analogs. To my knowledge, there isn't really any statistical data that points out, any sort of discrepancies between actual convictions of analogs versus controlled substances pre and post Turcotte.
Well, they still are able to convict those who are distributing analogs.
Do you have any other evidence besides the conviction rate in the Seventh Circuit?
But moving on.
Wait, before you move on, is there any way under your proposal that the government could prosecute a distributor who was not himself or herself a chemist?
Well, if they had knowledge from the chemist or they had knowledge of what the analog was. Because the only reason that a defendant...
Well, and having knowledge of what the analog was is a little different than having knowledge of the chemical structure, wouldn't you say?
Well, yes, but the only reason that a defendant has to meet this chemical structure requirement is because there is no published list of analogs like there is for controlled substances, which makes them unique.
In Staples, the court found truly that somebody had to understand the possession of the machine gun, that it actually was an illegal, it was illegal under the law. How would you view Staples, the result of Staples, in relationship to what you are arguing before us today?
Well, simply that the defendant must have knowledge of the qualities of the substance which rendered it illegal. And in that case for analogs, because they are such a difficult substance to know, it is necessary that the defendant understand that the actions that they took were illegal.
Why couldn't the quality simply be what the substance produces its effects? Why does it have to be the actual chemical composition? Wouldn't it be enough? The person says, this drug makes you feel just like ecstasy. And he tells that to people and believes that. Would that be enough to prosecute?
No, because it does not meet the analog definition. And the analog definition includes that chemical similarity.
Why couldn't that be separate? For example, if you prosecuted someone with cocaine, you bring in the fact that it's cocaine through a chemist. The defendant might not know what cocaine actually is. He just knows it's illegal. Wouldn't the same thing be true here? The defendant knows that it's a drug that acts like a controlled substance, and then a chemist says, and by the way, it has the same structure. Wouldn't that be sufficient to convict?
If the chemist, if he had knowledge of the similarity in chemical structure, that would be enough to convict. But just using the knowledge of effect, because there are many substances which are not considered to be analogs.
What's the constitutional basis for him having to know the chemical structure?
The basis is that he must have knowledge of the facts which rendered his actions illegal. And because analogs are so different from controlled substances, and they do not have that sort of
But are they so different?
notification.
I mean, they have the same effects. Are they really that different from a controlled substance?
They are different in that the way the government addresses them. Controlled substances are published in lists. They are highly publicized. People who choose to do so may look up what constitutes.
But you don't,
controlled
do you see any
substance.
practical, issues with publishing a list of analogs which can easily be used as a cookbook of sorts?
Well, certainly it would be up to the government and their best judgment if they believed that that was a viable way of going about making prosecutions easier under the Analog Act. And there are certainly issues that would arise from that, but it would make it considerably easier.
But doesn't the publication just give the bad guys a blueprint on how to tweak the formula again, just a little bit every 30 days and thereby avoid prosecution?
Well, that would be, of course, a consideration of the government in doing that. And the petitioner is not necessarily asking for that, but it is a step that they may take should they be so concerned about prosecuting these defendants.
How does the Fifth Amendment apply in this case?
Well, it is extremely difficult for the defendant to have knowledge of the acts or the qualities that make their actions illegal. So due process for
Counsel,
someone,
are you challenging the constitutionality of the act?
for the sense of vagueness, it is possible to consider it extremely vague to the point of the ordinary person. I see my time has run out. May I finish my
Counsel, go ahead and take 30 more seconds. We've asked you a lot of questions. Take
Thank
30
you.
more.
It would be extremely difficult for the ordinary person to understand the facts that made their conduct illegal. So on that sense, it would be possible to say that this act is too vague for the ordinary person to understand with a basic or even little chemical knowledge. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Shaw. Mr. Dale?
May it please the court, I am Paul Dell and I represent the petitioner in the case of McFadden v. United States. The Fourth Circuit erred in its decision to affirm the lower court's judgment. The government argues, contrary to the court's opinion in Flores-Figueroa v. United States, that the mens rea element does not strictly apply to the first clause of the Analog Act, that in analog cases, the government can prove mens rea for the chemical similarity clause at a lower standard than for the rest of the clauses, allowing extensive inferences to be made. The government has, in its argument, wrongfully called for the creation of a new precedent entirely without the backing of legal tradition or textual evidence. The regulated status argument would require that a jury find mens rea if it can be shown that the defendant knew that the pertinent substance had so-called regulated status. Regulated status as an argument is nonsensical because it would allow the government to convict a defendant who knew that his substance was regulated under any federal, state, or local law of a crime that is criminalized in a completely separate statute.
Counsel, that's a strong claim to say it's nonsensical. Doesn't it make sense for the government to want to avoid letting chemists and their colleagues off the hook by tweaking a chemical formula every 30 days?
It is completely reasonable, but the protection of their liberty, because there is no way for them to know conclusively that what they're doing is illegal.
But didn't your client, in fact, in this case, know that he was dealing with something illegal? Wasn't that his business model? He was selling very expensive items in a hush-hush fashion and making claims that they would have the effect of illegal substances. Isn't that exactly the sort of person this statute was intended to go after?
Well, just because he is acting suspiciously does not mean that he is committing a crime under the Analog Act. It may be that he is committing a crime under the Pure Food and Drug Act.
I'm not sure that he was acting suspiciously. He clearly was marketing his product in a manner that showed at least an intent that it had similar characteristics to controlled substances.
Under our interpretation, similar characteristics are not enough to prove that the defendant knew that the substance was a controlled substance analog.
But if you combine the totality of evidence, besides his furtive actions, with the prices that he was selling these drugs at, do you not feel as if he believed that he was selling something that was illegal?
No, because there is no expectation that just because something has a pharmacological effect that it is truly an analog or even illegal under statute in the United States. There are drugs that fall outside of the scope of the Analog Act, as they are not analogs at all in any way, shape, or form.
So what is the jury instruction you think should have been given that would have made this case appropriate?
We believe that the jury instruction should have included that the jury be instructed that to be convicted of the possession and or distribution under the Analog Act, the defendant must be shown to have known or intentionally avoided knowledge that the substance at hand was an analog of a controlled substance, meaning that the defendant must know both of the structural chemical substance similarity and the actual purported effects that make the substance a controlled substance analog.
Why is the first part necessary as a matter of constitutional law? Why was it necessary for him to know the chemical composition?
Because if he does not know the chemical composition and we work from just the second or third prongs, you've opened up a whole new slew of prosecutions for people who would otherwise be innocent just because they know of or purport to have an effect, a substance to have an effect.
Wait, so you're saying that they can purport to have the effect and it can actually have the effect, but as long as it doesn't have the same chemical structure, it's okay?
Yes, because if it's an analog and it fulfills the requirements of the first prong, then it truly will be prosecuted in such a way that the mens rea requirement, if it was to be fulfilled, would allow that person to go to jail.
So you're saying the defendant knew or should have known? Is that the instruction? Knew or should have known?
If the knew or due to a preponderance of the evidence, it's highly likely that they knew, and that is the jury's role to find.
Shouldn't he had some obligation if he's selling and marketing a drug or a drug-like substance that he should know? Wouldn't it be deliberate ignorance to choose not to know?
Well, there's no evidence that he chose actively not to know. If that was the case, that would be deliberate ignorance, and if the government could find those factual pieces of evidence in court and prove that.
However, in the case, it appears that McFadden specifically cautioned the other business partner not to talk in certain ways, as though he really did know that he probably was breaking the law. That's in the record.
Knowing that you are breaking a law is not the same thing as knowing that you are breaking the Analog Act or the Controlled Substances Act. He may have suspected that he was breaking a federal law or a state law, such as the Pure Food and Drug Act, which prohibits the sale of adulterated goods as drugs or supplements. But he did not know of the Analog Act, which was a fact that they proved at trial, and he was not aware.
But mistake of law is not a recognized offense. Isn't that essentially what you're arguing here? That because he didn't know precisely what law he might have been violating, he hasn't committed a crime?
Well, if the government is to convict him under the Analog Act, but establish his mens rea under a completely different act entirely, it does show a disconnect between what he is being sent to jail for 30 years for doing and the evidence that was used to convict him in the first place. And
Counsel, can you imagine a non-chemist satisfying the test that you propose? Isn't your proposal an effort to transform this statute into the non-chemists get out of jail free act because they don't have substantive knowledge of the chemical analysis?
We don't ask that they know specifically 100% what the chemical structure is, but what we do ask for in our jury instruction is
Would you be happy with something like the Turcotte inference, where from their purported psychological effects, the jury can find that they knew of the substantial similarity?
The petitioner would be more comfortable with the Turcotte inference than we would with the government's interpretation and the regulated status argument. But we also believe that Turcotte's inference can be too permissive in certain conditions. But at least in Turcotte, the jury is allowed to make that permissive inference and not required to, as in the government's argument.
Do you think that the statute is unconstitutionally vague?
In the absence of any mens rea requirement, yes, the petitioner would argue the statute.
But don't you, is it acceptable that there's a mens rea component that you know that you're distributing something for human consumption? Does that get it over the hurdle?
The petitioner would argue no, because human consumption on its own is not intended to protect any defendant from prosecution. In fact, Congress specifically added that to protect legitimate scientific pursuits. It was never intended in any way to be the primary mens rea requirement.
But does intent really matter? I mean, as long as it's in the law, shouldn't we just pay attention to it?
Intent matters, but even if we completely ignore congressional intent and we move back to the plain text alone of the law, our interpretation is still far more well supported than the government's assertion that regulated status is enough to establish a mens rea requirement.
Do you think that is it your position that if there is a scienter or a mens rea component for that first prong, that would remove the statute from being potentially unconstitutionally vague, that would save the statute?
Yes, that is our view.
Counsel, let me just ask a question. In Mr. McFadden's own language, he referred to substances like white powder. He sold his substances in baggies, as he referred to them, and at times they cost $1,980 an ounce. What legitimate thoughts could he have been thinking?
There is a legitimate gray market for pharmaceuticals in the United States that is not regulated under the Analog Act or the CSA, and they are generally sold with the same characteristics as
But was McFadden doing it legitimately?
The question is not whether he was doing it legitimately, it is whether through the body of circumstantial evidence you can prove that he was doing it illegitimately, and there is still the possibility open that he did not know and that he did believe in some way it was legitimate.
But isn't that a jury question? Shouldn't
Yes.
the jury decide, did he have sufficient knowledge?
Yes, and that's what
And in this case, the jury did decide and convicted.
Our issue is with the jury instruction, which is what they decided his knowledge based on, not whether a jury is a legitimate way of going forward with.
Was there any
legal process.
scienter instruction to the jury?
The only scienter instruction to the jury in McFadden's case was the human consumption element, which they found him liable under because it was most definitely provable.
Would you find it sufficient, would the petitioner find it sufficient if he also just simply indicated that he knew it was like a controlled substance? Without knowing the chemical composition, but he knew because of its effects, it was very much like ecstasy, heroin, a controlled substance. Would that be sufficient knowledge?
Once again, under the Turcotte inference, that would be, but the petitioner would like to point to the fact that there are substances that have those same effects that are not, most definitely not controlled under the Analog Act. or the
So,
Controlled
I
Substance
mean,
Act.
don't you think that potentially eliminating the knowledge element of the chemical similarity, that would also address the issue with, these drugs that you're mentioning that are not controlled substance analogs, but they do have the same effects?
That would be extending the act far beyond what Congress intended. The title of the act is the Analog Act, so extending it to all drugs that have any effect on human beings similar to a controlled substance.
Right.
If the DEA actually used its emergency powers list more aggressively and actually published on the websites analogs as they found them, would that then rescue the Analog Act, in your opinion?
Yes, it would rescue it from this vagueness and this argument, but as a pragmatic concern, it opens up dealers and chemists to this whole new world of knowledge that they might not have had before, and that is, in the end.
But that's part of your argument, is that you're saying that they have to have knowledge. Well, as the DEA, refresh this list every week, the knowledge would be there on the internet.
Yes, in fact, we would say that.
But would the defendant still have to know that he possessed it? Isn't that the issue? Where the jury should have been instructed the defendant knew. So even if it was listed, would you still argue that there should be at least an instruction telling that the defendant knew that what he possessed now was part of one of the chemicals listed that was illegal?
Yes, if there was a list, if that was to be the DEA's choice in resolving this, and the defendant.
Counsel, how's that any different than the cocaine situation? If I'm dealing cocaine and I take the position at trial that I didn't know that cocaine was a controlled substance and that it was unlawful to sell cocaine, would that be a valid defense? And isn't that exactly what you're arguing here?
It depends on whether you at trial, if you could prove that you had no legitimate knowledge and that you were not willfully ignorant, but rather you were ignorant because you had no idea and it was completely legitimate. That would be your mistake. But if you knew you had a controlled substance and you were selling it for a large amount of money, in that situation, because the Controlled Substances Act, if you are convicted under it, you don't need to prove that they knew exactly which controlled substance it was. All you need to do is prove that it was a controlled substance and they knew that it was a controlled substance, then you would be convicted.
It seems to me if they're to know that the controlled substance analog that I'm in possession of is substantially similar in chemical composition to a controlled substance, they would by that very nature know that what they are possessing is a controlled substance.
The way the Analog Act reads into the Controlled Substance Act, says that for the purposes of law and for the purposes of conviction, a controlled substance analog will be treated as a controlled substance. But by nature, a controlled substance analog is not the same thing as a controlled substance. You can know conclusively before trial if something is a controlled substance or not. But when you consider an analog, there's absolutely no way, unless you are a chemist.
So why is the burden of mens rea the same for two different things? You have controlled substance and controlled substance analogs, but you're asking us to apply the same level of mens rea.
In fact, we are actually asking that this court apply a higher level of mens rea to the Controlled Substance Analog Act, simply because it is not possible for the defendant to know before trial if what they have is in fact an illegal substance or if they are completely innocent of any crime.
Counsel, would you concede that the Congress, in adopting this legislation, was intending to reach behavior such as your clients, that the Congress was tired of the cat and mouse game of chemists and their colleagues jumping ahead of or jumping around the list of controlled substances? This was what Congress was getting at. And you might concede they did it inartfully, but would you concede this is the intention of the Congress?
We would concede that to a certain point this is the intention of Congress, but we believe that Congress, and it is supported well in the congressional briefs surrounding the passage of this act, that Congress really did intend to target the people who are driving that innovation, the chemists themselves, and not necessarily the distribution system itself on its own. And we would also say to that just because chemists are the drivers and they must know that what they're doing is an illegal act and that they're innovating on something and to make it an analog, just because of that fact, they can be convicted easily and quickly.
Thank you, Mr. Dell. We'll now hear from you, Mr. Davis.
May it please the court. My name is Cameron Davis, and I represent the respondent in the case of McFadden versus the United States. Although the Court of Appeals relied on faulty reasoning, its ultimate judgment affirming petitioner's convictions and its holding that the district court did not abuse its discretion in declining to accept petitioner's proposed jury instruction were correct and should be affirmed by this court. Petitioner is correct in arguing that the Analog Act's mental state requirement should be governed by the CSA's mental state requirement. However, the government should only have to prove that the substance was intended for human consumption by the defendant and that the defendant knowingly distributed that illegal substance.
Counsel, it looks to me as though this law was passed as sort of a gotcha in the first place. In other words, by not creating a list of analog drugs, sort of lying in wait for the chemist who will know what they're doing, but McFadden is a guy in the middle. This was really intended not to catch him, but to catch the actual chemist. So, how does your case prove that that McFadden actually knew what he was doing was wrong, and in fact that the Analog Act purposely does not publish, does not require the publication of the analogs?
Sure. The petitioner's countertextual chemist-only limitation, which is something that you were referencing earlier, in terms of Congress only wanting to go after the chemist, hardly makes any sense in the grander scheme of things. In 1906, when Congress passed this act, analogs were increasing nationally, both domestically and internationally through trade. And a lot of these individuals were trying to simply create analogs to permanently stay ahead of the government. As such,
isn't there a Fifth Amendment right under due process that if a citizen is going to be prosecuted for something, they must know that their act is actually illegal?
Right, of course. And that's why we disagree with the lower court's argument that human consumption is the only scienter requirement necessary. Rather, the government believes that a knowledge of regulated status or a knowledge of identity would be theories of knowledge would be significantly better in terms of making sure that individuals knew what they were doing was illicit.
Was the jury instructed as to that?
No, the jury.
So then you would agree they should be reversed because the jury wasn't properly instructed.
No, the ultimate decision was correct, and given that the Supreme Court's precedent history is deciding on the ultimate decision and not the method of reaching that decision, the government's opinion still stands in this case.
It wasn't the decision. It was a question of as a matter of due process, constitutional law, was the defendant entitled to a jury instruction that he knew that what he was doing was unlawful, that the substance he had was unlawful. The only thing, as you point out, that the court instructed the jury was that it was for human consumption, and you just conceded that that's not enough.
Right.
So nothing else was offered, so then it should be reversed. This case should be reversed, and we should hold that throughout the country, all the circuits agree that you must inform the jury that before you convict the defendant, that person knows that what they have is illegal or similar, it's a substance that's similar to what's in the Controlled Substance Act.
But right, ultimately, the case shouldn't be retried because, as was heard in previous oral arguments with the counsel for the petitioner, the individual in this case clearly knew what he was doing was illicit, had dealt with regulated statuses and illegality. So the actual case,
But we're not a trial court. We're not here to hear an actual case. We're trying to make a policy.
Right.
So our question is, should a jury be instructed about the type of knowledge that the defendant has to possess before he's convicted? And you're saying that the fact that it was simply for human consumption, that's not enough, right? That's what you're arguing. And that's what the petitioner's arguing, and that there's needs something more, such as that this is a controlled substance, or it's like a controlled substance. So in that case, you would agree, the government would agree, that we should do more. More should have been, as a matter of course and policy, there should be more of an instruction about the defendant's knowledge.
As a matter of broader policy, yes, the government concedes that more should have been done in this individual case. But petitioner still is trying to encourage a retrying and an ultimate innocence and not guilty finding for the defendant in this case, whereas McFadden, through the plethora of evidence against him and through his clear knowledge of the regulated status that the government would advise in future policy-making cases, then those...
At least a little bit... Counsel, we had not anticipated that you would frame your argument this way. It sounds to us like you're conceding that the original jury instruction was incorrect.
Correct.
If the jury instruction was incorrect, he's entitled to a new trial.
But it gets back to the point that because the exact same decision would be reached either way...
How do we know that? How do we know what the jury would have said if they'd been given the proper instruction?
Because with the proper instruction of the knowledge of regulated status deals with the compounding of evidence for example, the amount that he's selling them for, the individual packaging or the appearance of the drugs and where he's selling them. So in any case, McFadden will be guilty in the end, regardless of whether or not human consumption is the only... Sorry. Oh.
Yeah, well, no, I was just about to say, what if I'm actually the consumer? I'm the person, taking this. I go to McFadden and I'm like, look, I am trying to stay up all night writing papers. I need something that gives me that energy. And he sells me. He doesn't necessarily tell me much about it. He says, this is going to do it. Am I now in violation of the act? I mean, I don't know that it's substantially similar. I haven't even had representations.
Sure.
But under your thing, and I'm not, under your piece of it, I'm intending to consume it. I'm intending to use it. Would I be guilty? Or do I have to actually, like in the Controlled Substance Act, where you have to knowingly or intentionally, know that you have a controlled substance?
Sure. So in the Analog Act is dealing with the chemists and the distributors of the drugs, not the actual consumers. However, because presumably you would take the drugs after purchasing them, you would therefore be aware of the psychological and physiological effects of those drugs that you just took because you were trying to study.
What if it's felt no different from Red Bull or something like that?
And that's when you go to court and substantial similarities actually compared. The chemical structure of the two drugs in regards to the analog and both prongs, the physiological effects and the chemical structure.
So I could actually be convicted. I purchased something from a general GNC or from Mr. McFadden, and I could actually be convicted. I think I've just bought something that's slightly better than Red Bull. But I think I bought something.
But you're not trying to distribute the actual drugs.
You are consuming it.
I am consuming. I'm consuming. I'm going right home and I'm going to consume it and stay up for days on end.
Right.
That's the plan.
But this case, in terms of McFadden, as well as the Analog Act in its entirety, the intention of that is to deal with the distributors of those drugs, the people who are getting it to the final end. And especially, as mentioned earlier, because it's been almost 30 years since the act was passed, and individuals' drug use has skyrocketed in those past 30 years.
But don't you think it's a little bit convenient to ignore prongs within the law? I mean, ignoring the fact that someone has to have knowledge of what they have. Don't you think it's just convenient for the government to ignore that?
But there's no constitutional basis for individuals to have to know each individual prong of the actual law.
But wait, under the Fifth Amendment, And I would assume that you support U.S. versus McLam, that you acknowledge that in order for someone to be punished under the law, they have to understand the law. They have to understand they're actually breaking the law. It can't be a gotcha law where we withdraw information because we're really going after somebody other than a McFadden.
But this gets back to the actual definition of analogs within themselves. And because analogs, it's not necessarily possible to strictly define analogs or list them because it would give some sort of twisted cookbook for individuals to create these drugs in the long run. So any actual knowledge of substantial similarity isn't necessarily possible until
Counsel, it sounds like you're conceding this is vague, that we cannot specify what is similar. Doesn't that constitute a vague statute?
So in this case, there's no real world evidence throughout case law, throughout precedents of this actual case that's substantially similar or anything in the act is unconstitutionally vague. Disagreeing experts are called in all the time.
No, this isn't really a point of evidence. This is a point of English grammar, English vocabulary. The word similar is vague.
Right, and both the DEA experts throughout history, as well as individuals brought in to try cases, understand that it's not necessarily a scientific term. But given that analogs themselves, the whole point of it is staying ahead of the law.
Doesn't that mean that the statute is vague because it cannot precisely define what is to be prohibited?
While it may be vague, that doesn't necessarily either deal with constitutionality or deal with the individuals being